Welcome in. Tonight we descend, not just beneath the stone and gold of St. Peter's Basilica, but into something deeper, a silence history rarely dares to break. Beneath the grandeur of Vatican City lies a buried world of forgotten names, sealed vaults, ancient graves, and secrets the Church has tried for centuries to contain. This isn't about scandal for scandal's sake. It's about memory, what we choose to preserve, and what we bury under marble and myth. The Vatican may be a beacon of faith, but like all great monuments, it casts a long shadow. And tonight, we're walking through it. If you find yourself drawn to these hidden histories, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it truly adds something to your nights. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? I love watching this quiet constellation light up across the world. Dim the lights. Settle in. We're going underground. There is a place beneath St. Peter's Basilica that few speak of, and fewer still are allowed to enter. It is neither a crypt nor a museum, but something stranger, a layered world of tombs, altars, walls, and whispers buried over centuries like sediment in a sacred riverbed. Most visitors come to marvel at the dome designed by Michelangelo or to trace the golden letters around the nave, but almost none realize they are standing above a Roman necropolis. This underground city predates the Basilica, predates Christianity as a state religion, and might even predate the martyrdom it was built to honor. The belief that St. Peter is buried beneath the high altar is central to the Vatican's authority. That belief begins with blood, his execution by crucifixion in the Circus of Nero during the reign of Emperor Nero, likely around the year 64 or 67 CE. Early Christian tradition holds that Peter, deemed too unworthy to die as Christ had, was crucified upside down and buried in a shallow grave near the site of his death. Over the following centuries, memory turned into monument. Constantine, the first Christian emperor, constructed a basilica in the 4th century directly above what was believed to be Peter's tomb. He raised the necropolis's upper levels to make way for the new church. But much of the deeper tombs were preserved, entombed themselves under marble, soil, and time. For more than 1,600 years, those chambers lay mostly undisturbed. It was only in the 1940s, during a secretive excavation ordered by Pope Pius XII, that their full extent was rediscovered. Archaeologists working in silence and under the Vatican's careful watch uncovered ancient burial niches, graffiti begging Peter for intercession, and bones believed by some to be the apostles' own. But there is more down there than just relics and hope. Pagan tombs, imperial inscriptions, mismatched remains. The path to Peter is not a straight line. It winds through layers of belief, myth, manipulation, and quiet control. As we begin this journey under the dome, remember, some truths were buried not by accident, but by design. The question of whether St. Peter's remains truly rest beneath the Vatican has hovered like incense over the altar for nearly 2,000 years. Christianity teaches that Peter, once a fisherman of Galilee, became the first bishop of Rome and was martyred for his faith. The earliest known reference to his grave being located on Vatican Hill comes from the Roman priest Gaius, writing near the end of the 2nd century. In a surviving fragment, he confidently points to the trophies of the apostles on the Vatican slope, suggesting both Peter and Paul were venerated at known, visible sites. But for centuries, no official church doctrine confirmed the exact location of Peter's body, and the Vatican itself remained publicly silent. When Pope Pius XII authorized excavations beneath the high altar in 1939, following the accidental discovery of an ancient tomb during renovations for his predecessor's burial, it was not announced to the world. The work was done quietly, and the team, led by Jesuit Father Antonio Ferrua and a small group of archaeologists, labored under the Vatican's strict secrecy. What they found was astonishing. A preserved Roman necropolis stretching beneath the basilica, filled with tombs, inscriptions, and sarcophagi dating from the 2nd to 4th centuries. At the heart of the site was a modest, wall-enclosed grave marked by red plaster and graffiti scrawled in Latin and Greek. Invocations to Peter, calls for his prayers. Some of the markings read simply, Petros eini, or Peter is here. Adjacent to this was a niche containing a box of bones wrapped in expensive purple cloth traced with gold thread. It wasn't until decades later, under Pope Paul VI, that these bones were publicly associated with Peter. In 1968, the Pope declared that the relics had been identified in a way that we can consider convincing, though he carefully avoided terms like proof. Scientific examination by anthropologist Margherita Guarducci suggested the bones belonged to a man in his 60s, buried in haste, consistent with Peter's supposed martyrdom. Yet questions remain. The bones were found not directly in the grave, but in a side cavity, leading some to believe they had been moved and hidden. Whether out of reverence or subterfuge, we may never know. What we do know is that the search for Peter's bones tells us more about the Church's need for continuity than it does about the man himself. When Emperor Constantine the Great embraced Christianity in the early 4th century, he did not merely legalize the faith, he transformed its relationship with power, architecture, and memory. His construction of the first basilica atop Vatican Hill around the year 324 was not a symbolic gesture. It was a calculated act of religious and imperial consolidation. According to Christian tradition, Constantine's mother, Helena, traveled to the Holy Land and recovered sacred relics, including pieces of the true cross. But while Helena was looking eastward, Constantine looked to Rome's western flank. The choice to build the basilica over Peter's grave was deliberate. The area had once been home to the gardens of Nero, the site of Christian executions, including Peter's own. Constantine ordered the original necropolis partially leveled and then entombed beneath a raised platform so that his new basilica could be built directly over the revered grave. This was not an easy feat. Engineers had to carve through a cemetery without disturbing the sanctity of its remains, and then fill the hillside with earth to form a flat base. The result was a massive burial of the old world beneath the emerging church. What few know is that in the course of this transformation, Constantine also left behind something of his own, a sealed chamber, referred to obliquely in medieval architectural diagrams but never officially confirmed. Some believe it was a reliquary vault, others suggest it was a kind of sanctum, where Constantine deposited imperial offerings to St. Peter. According to fragments from the Liber Pontificalis and later apocryphal writings, Constantine placed gifts of gold and silver within the foundations, a tiara, a scepter, and a gold cross weighing over 150 pounds. Though the reliability of these sources is debated, there are accounts from early pilgrims who mention seeing fragments of imperial artifacts in the Confessio, the recessed space in front of Peter's tomb. Whether the chamber still exists or whether it was collapsed during later reconstructions is a question Vatican archaeologists rarely entertain in public. But within the hidden folds of foundation stones and mosaic floors, there is the suggestion that Constantine left not only a church, but a buried altar to his own legacy, entombed like the saint he chose to honor. If it exists, it remains untouched, perhaps waiting for a future emperor of faith or ambition to find it. Long before pilgrims knelt under the soaring dome of St. Peter's Basilica, long before Michelangelo's chisel touched stone or Constantine's masons laid their first foundation, the Vatican Hill was a place of burial. Not a Christian sanctuary, but a Roman necropolis, a city of the dead carved into the slope just outside the ancient city walls. In Roman custom, the dead were not buried within the city but along its roads, often in elaborately decorated tombs meant to preserve memory and status. One such road, the Via Cornelia, once ran directly across what is now the floor of St. Peter's Basilica. Along it, families built mausolea, filled them with painted walls, carved inscriptions, and the ashes or bones of their loved ones. The Vatican necropolis, rediscovered in stages beginning with Constantine's foundation work and fully revealed only in the 20th century, is one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the Christian world. This burial ground is not just a historical curiosity, it is the literal foundation upon which centuries of theology and authority have been constructed. When excavations resumed under the Vatican in the 1940s, what emerged was a street lined with tombs, some dating as far back as the late 1st century. These were not paupers' graves. Many were built for Roman elites, freedmen, and early Christians who mingled Roman funerary art with Christian symbols. In one mausoleum, painted peacocks adorn the wall, symbols of immortality in both pagan and Christian iconography. Another bears the image of Orpheus, whose journey to the underworld was reimagined by early Christians as a foreshadowing of Christ's descent and resurrection. Among these was a humble grave located near the central spine of the necropolis, marked with graffiti and petitions for intercession. It was this site that tradition identified as Peter's burial place, and around which Constantine centered his basilica. But what remains extraordinary is how much of this city of the dead was left intact. Rather than desecrate it entirely, Constantine's builders entombed it, covering it with soil and creating a literal underworld beneath the Christian sanctuary above. Today, when one walks through the Scavi Tour under layers of marble and relics, the walls of ancient tombs still echo with the names and prayers of the forgotten, Romans whose lives were buried but not erased. The tradition of burying popes within the walls of St. Peter's Basilica began not as a matter of sacred continuity, but as a deliberate expression of authority and control. To be interred near the tomb of the Apostle Peter was not simply a gesture of devotion, it was a political statement. In the earliest centuries of the Church, Christian bishops and martyrs were often buried in catacombs or simple graves outside Rome. But as the papacy grew in prominence, the location of a pope's final resting place began to reflect the weight of his reign. By the time of Pope Leo IV in the 5th century, burial near Peter's supposed grave had become a coveted privilege, reserved for those considered worthy of spiritual and institutional legacy. As centuries passed, the papal tomb became more than a site of remembrance. It became part of the visual and physical structure of the church itself. During the medieval period, popes were often buried directly beneath the basilica's floors, their names etched into slabs of marble under the feet of worshippers. Yet not every pope received such honor. The politics of succession, accusations of heresy, or the shifting tides of papal favor could determine whether a pontiff was entombed in glory or obscured in silence. Some tombs were quietly moved, others intentionally destroyed. The most infamous case remains that of Pope Formosus, whose body was exhumed and placed on trial in 897 during the Cadaver Synod, a grotesque spectacle that ended with his corpse being stripped of vestments and thrown into the Tiber River. His burial rites were later restored, but the message had already been sent. In more recent centuries, the papal necropolis beneath the current basilica has become a carefully curated gallery of power. From the Baroque grandeur of Urban VIII to the more austere sarcophagus of Pius XII, each tomb reflects a different age's vision of papal identity. Some lie in ornate chapels behind locked gates. Others are nestled in alcoves, visible only to those who know where to look. And still, the question remains, what determines which popes are remembered in stone and which are left to fade? In a church defined by continuity, Even death is shaped by the politics of legacy. Beneath the towering baldachin of St. Peter's Basilica, under the shadow of Bernini's bronze canopy and the oculus of Michelangelo's dome, lies the high altar, one of the most sacred places in Catholicism. It is here that only the Pope may celebrate Mass, and it is said to stand directly above the grave of St. Peter. But between the gilded surface and the apostles' bones lies a complex structure that has long stirred questions and speculation. The altar itself rests atop a platform known as the Confessio, a sunken space created to allow pilgrims a view of Peter's resting place without disturbing the sanctity of the tomb. This architectural decision was inherited from Constantine's original basilica, which had a similar configuration, though smaller and less ornate. But behind the aesthetic grace of this layout is a history of deliberate concealment and layered symbolism. During the 1940s excavations, archaeologists discovered that the central niche of Peter's supposed tomb, the so-called Trophy of Gaius, had been enclosed in a haphazard wall during the 3rd century. It was this wall, covered in graffiti invoking Peter's name, that would become the focal point of the church's claim to possess his remains. Strangely, however, the bones believed to be Peter's were not found in the tomb itself, but in a cavity behind the graffiti wall, carefully wrapped in purple and gold cloth and placed in a niche researchers had not even known existed. This placement raised difficult questions. Why would the bones of the first pope have been removed from the original grave and relocated into a concealed wall? Some argue it was for protection during the persecution of Christians in the 3rd century. Others suggest it may have been a calculated move during the Constantinian building project to preserve relics while maintaining the narrative of uninterrupted veneration. Even stranger is the fact that the bones in the tomb below the altar that had traditionally been assumed to belong to Peter turned out to belong to multiple individuals, both male and female, and of varying ages. Only the bones in the hidden niche were attributed to a single older man. Whether by chance or careful design, the altar that millions pass beneath each year does more than mark a grave. It conceals a mystery embedded in layers of architecture, devotion, and unresolved doubt. It stands tall in the center of St. Peter's Square, casting a long shadow over pilgrims and tourists alike. But few realize that the Vatican obelisk is the last surviving witness of Rome's most brutal executions. Carved from red granite and weighing more than 300 tons, the obelisk is over 25 meters high and originally came from Heliopolis, Egypt, a city sacred to the sun god Ra. It was brought to Rome during the reign of Emperor Caligula in the early 1st century CE, not as a trophy of war, but as a symbol of imperial domination. Caligula placed the obelisk in the central spine of his private circus, an elongated stadium used for chariot races and executions on the Vatican Hill. This was not merely a space for sport, it was a site of terror. According to early Christian sources, it was here, in the shadow of this Egyptian monument, that many of Rome's first martyrs were put to death, including, by most accounts, St. Peter himself. He was crucified during the reign of Emperor Nero, possibly around 64 CE, as part of a wave of persecutions following the Great Fire of Rome. The obelisk would have loomed over the blood-soaked arena, silent and unmoved, as Peter was nailed to the cross upside down. When Constantine later raised the remains of the circus to build his basilica, the obelisk was left untouched, too heavy to move and perhaps too saturated in memory to be repurposed. It remained in the same position for nearly 1,500 years. Only in 1586 was it relocated to its current place in front of the basilica by order of Pope Sixtus V. The engineer Domenico Fontana undertook the perilous task, using an elaborate system of ropes, pulleys, and scaffolding to shift the massive stone. The effort required hundreds of workers and was so dangerous that speaking was forbidden during the operation. Atop the obelisk now sits a cross, but beneath that cross lies a bronze sphere believed to have once held relics, possibly of Julius Caesar or Egyptian deities. Today, the obelisk is mistaken for mere decoration, but it remains the only surviving object from Nero's circus. It saw the death of Peter, and perhaps countless others, and though it bears no inscription on its face, it is perhaps the most eloquent witness to one of the darkest chapters of Christian history. From its earliest days, Christianity held a profound connection to the bodies of the dead. In a religion built on the resurrection of one man, the bones of others, especially those who died for their faith, became touchstones of belief, fragments of divine witness preserved in flesh and stone. The Vatican is not merely a house of prayer, it is a reliquary on an unimaginable scale. Its walls, altars, and crypts contain bones and dust believed to belong to apostles, saints, and early martyrs. And though many of these claims are impossible to verify, they have shaped the geography of Christian devotion for centuries. During the persecutions of the first 3 centuries, Christians often buried their dead in catacombs outside the city walls, where they could grieve and remember in secret. But as the Church gained power, it began to move its saints inward. Bones were disinterred from humble graves and brought into basilicas, sealed inside altars and placed beneath domes. The logic was both spiritual and political. Proximity to a martyr sanctified a place, and relics, in turn, drew pilgrims and reinforced ecclesiastical authority. Nowhere is this dynamic more vivid than at St. Peter's. The belief that Peter's bones lie beneath the high altar has justified the placement of the papal throne, the construction of the Basilica, and the Vatican's very identity. But beyond Peter, countless other remains are said to rest beneath the Basilica. These include fragments attributed to Saints Simon and Jude, relics of Saint Gregory the Great, and the remains of unnamed early believers discovered during the 20th century excavations of the necropolis. Yet this sacred accumulation has a darker side. The trade in relics during the Middle Ages turned human remains into commodities. Bones of uncertain origin were bought, sold, and even faked to meet the demand of shrines across Christendom. Some relics found their way into St. Peter's through unclear channels. Others were quietly removed, their authenticity doubted or politically inconvenient. Even today, the exact contents of many Vatican reliquaries are known only to a few within the archives. Behind the reverence lies a long history of secrecy, substitution, and silence. What began as a way to honor sacrifice became, in time, a powerful tool, one that blurred the line between memory and manipulation. When Pope Pius XI died in February 1939, his burial plans set in motion an event that would peel back the Vatican's most sacred floor and uncover secrets long entombed beneath it. During preparations for his tomb in the grottos below St. Peter's Basilica, workers unexpectedly broke through into a void, a space that had not appeared in any modern plans. What they found was no ordinary substructure. It was the edge of an ancient Roman necropolis, preserved beneath centuries of marble and silence. Within weeks, Pope Pius XII quietly authorized a full archaeological investigation, known internally as the scavi, or excavations. The operation began in near-total secrecy. To avoid drawing attention, the team consisted of a small group of trusted experts, including Jesuit scholars and Italian archaeologists, who worked in shifts beneath the basilica while the Vatican continued its public liturgies above. Between 1940 and 1949, they unearthed a city of the dead, tombs, walls, sarcophagi, and mosaic floors, dating back nearly 2 millennia. The necropolis stretched west to east, its chambers built into the side of Vatican Hill, its artistry a blend of pagan and early Christian symbolism. The most startling discovery came near the center, a monument that matched the second-century description of the Trophy of Gaius, a simple shrine believed to mark the grave of Peter. But the excavation team faced an immediate challenge. As they dug toward what tradition claimed was Peter's tomb, they found an assortment of bones in multiple locations. Some were within the earth beneath the shrine. Others were found in a small cavity behind a red wall inscribed with graffiti calling on Peter's name. Most were commingled from individuals of different ages and sexes. One box of bones stood apart. Wrapped in purple cloth threaded with gold, they were later analyzed by Professor Margherita Guarducci, who concluded they belonged to an elderly man, robust in build, buried without his feet. The absence of feet was interpreted as evidence of crucifixion, where the feet may have remained on the cross or decayed differently. In 1968, Pope Paul VI announced that the bones were identified in a manner which we can hold to be convincing, yet he stopped short of declaring absolute certainty. Even among Vatican insiders, questions lingered. Had they truly found Peter, or had they found what they most needed to believe? The great excavation had reached its climax, but its findings only deepened the mystery. Hidden beneath the marble splendor of St. Peter's Basilica lies a passage that few have seen and even fewer are allowed to speak about. Known unofficially by some archivists and custodians as the Apostolic Trap Door, this unmarked access point sits beneath the Confessio, near the altar said to be directly above St. Peter's grave. Though the Vatican never refers to it publicly by name, it has appeared in architectural blueprints and maintenance records dating back to the 17th century. The passage leads downward, not to the well-known grottos open to pilgrims, but deeper, into a narrow corridor cut through ancient stone and filled with stale, unmoving air. Here, the sense of time distorts. The frescoes give way to raw Roman brick. Iron fixtures rust in place. Echoes carry farther than they should. Some believe this corridor was part of Constantine's original substructure, possibly used by builders to access the necropolis without disturbing its tombs from above. Others suggest it was created later, during medieval renovations, to hide or transport relics away from the prying eyes of reformers, invaders, or even rival cardinals. There is at least one documented account from the early 1800s when Napoleonic forces occupied parts of Rome and attempted to claim religious treasures. According to a handwritten note found in the Vatican secret archives, several objects, among them a reliquary of great antiquity and a fragment of a cross said to be miraculous, were moved through a servus passaggio inferiore, just days before French troops entered the city. Whether this passage is the same as the so-called Apostolic Trap Door is unclear, but the connection is more than plausible. Recent restoration work during the Jubilee year 2000 reportedly uncovered a sealed door within the corridor that has never been opened in modern times. It bears no handle, only a series of small etched symbols, possibly medieval, possibly older. Vatican engineers dismissed it as a storage vault, but no effort has been made to explore it further. The path into the underchambers has since been reinforced and locked, accessible only with layered permissions. What lies beyond the final door, relics, records, or something deliberately forgotten, remains unknown. But one thing is certain, this gateway exists, not only as a relic of architecture, but as a threshold through which time itself seems to bend. Beneath the sweeping arches and luminous mosaics of St. Peter's Basilica lies a paradox the Church has never fully explained. For all its claims to sacred continuity and divine foundation, the ground on which it stands is deeply pagan. The Vatican Hill, before it became the epicenter of global Catholicism, was neither holy nor revered. It was marginal land, located just beyond the ancient Pomerium, the religious boundary of the city of Rome. Roman aristocrats used the hillside for gardens, villas, and eventually burial plots. These tombs, carved into the slope and arranged along the Via Cornelia, housed generations of Roman citizens who died believing in gods very different from the Christian pantheon. During the mid-1st century, the area also became a place of execution. Nero's circus stood nearby, and early Christian sources claim that Peter himself was martyred there, crucified upside down in mockery of the Messiah he followed. When Constantine ordered the construction of the first St. Peter's Basilica in the 4th century, he made a radical decision. Instead of leveling the necropolis entirely, he buried it. The soil raised the hill and created a flat surface upon which to build the church, preserving many of the tombs beneath the new structure. Among the preserved graves were several that bore unmistakably pagan imagery: winged victories, Orphic scenes, depictions of Mercury, and mosaics celebrating Roman domestic virtues. One particularly well-preserved tomb features the god Mithras slaying the sacred bull, a central motif in a mystery religion that rivaled Christianity in its early years. These images were not erased, they were covered. The Church chose to build over them rather than destroy them, creating a literal and symbolic foundation upon which Christianity would rise. In modern times, as archaeological teams uncovered more of the necropolis, the presence of these pagan tombs posed a theological dilemma. Some scholars attempted to reinterpret the imagery as proto-Christian symbolism. Others simply ignored them. But the fact remains: the bones of emperors' servants, priests of Roman gods, and unnamed believers in forgotten rites lie just feet beneath the tomb of the apostle. These are the ghosts the basilica cannot entirely exorcise. Their presence lingers not only in stone and mosaic, but in the uneasy silence that hangs in the air when visitors pass beneath the dome, never knowing that the roots of the church lie tangled with the ruins of older gods. In the year 1577, a little-known Benedictine monk named Amadeo of Siena completed a peculiar drawing that he claimed was based on older, vanished diagrams passed down by papal engineers. It was a floor plan, sort of, sketched in faded ink on calfskin vellum and labeled in Latin and Italian. But what made the map strange was that it did not depict the visible basilica. Instead, it mapped a network of corridors, chambers, and sealed rooms beneath the Vatican, some of which do not appear on any modern architectural plans. The Mappa Sottoterra, as it came to be known in obscure Vatican catalogues, was quietly filed away and largely forgotten until the 19th century, when it resurfaced in a compilation of marginal documents collected during the pontificate of Pope Leo XIII. What scholars found most curious were not the corridors themselves, many of which matched known substructures beneath the basilica, but the annotations. One chamber, marked Thalamus Silentii, was situated to the west of the Confessio and was described as a room where no rite is performed, but which is never to be opened. Another, labeled Arca 5, was sketched as a rectangular vault directly beneath the high altar. No current access tunnel or stairway leads to such a space. For decades, Vatican archivists dismissed the map as speculative, a blend of mystical imagination and flawed geometry. But after the mid-20th century, Scavi uncovered previously unknown tombs and corridors that loosely corresponded to portions of Amadeo's map. The document took on new significance. Some now believe it may be a preserved memory of Constantinian construction or even earlier Roman planning. A few fringe researchers go further, suggesting that the Vatican possesses multiple layers of sealed architecture never documented for public consumption. There are rumors of a second mirror map kept in the Apostolic Archive, annotated during the Renaissance by a cryptographer working for Pope Sixtus IV. Its location is classified, its contents unconfirmed. Still, in quiet corners of the Vatican Library, facsimiles of Amadeo's map are occasionally studied by those seeking to understand not only the shape of what lies beneath the basilica, but the mindset of those who buried it. For what is a map, after all, but a confession of knowledge someone once tried to preserve and someone else tried to hide? Near the central axis of the Vatican necropolis, just meters from the place tradition holds as the tomb of the Apostle Peter, there is a chamber that remains sealed. Unlike other tombs and mausolea excavated during the scavi of the 1940s, this particular room was not opened, photographed, or catalogued in any of the official publications. Internally, among those who worked on the project, it became known as La Stanza Vietata, the Forbidden Room. Its existence was first noted in the excavation journals of Professor Enrico Hossi, an Italian archaeologist brought in to assess structural integrity during the final phases of the dig in 1950. In a single handwritten entry, he described a closed vault of unusual masonry, lacking any visible inscription, fitted with a primitive ventilation shaft sealed at both ends. The note is cryptic and was omitted from later printed summaries, but cross-referencing the site map suggests the room lies immediately southeast of the Trophy of Gaius, beneath the level of the red graffiti wall. In architectural terms, it is unusual. The chamber does not follow the symmetrical grid of the necropolis. Its walls are thicker, and the construction suggests it may have predated Constantine's intervention. No funerary markings exist near its threshold. No sarcophagus was ever documented inside. Most intriguing of all, the Vatican excavation team chose to halt work before breaching it. The official explanation, according to internal memos preserved in the Vatican Library, was concern over structural stability and the proximity to sacred relics. But several members of the archaeological team reportedly objected to this decision. In private correspondence now stored in academic archives outside the Vatican, Father Ferrua himself allegedly expressed frustration that important leads were being ignored in the name of discretion. Since then, no known attempt has been made to enter the room. It has become something of a ghost within the Vatican's historical narrative, a presence acknowledged only by absence. No pilgrim sees it, no official mentions it. Yet those who know the layout of the necropolis are aware that something remains, sealed, untouched, and inches away from the grave of the man upon whom the church was built. What lies behind its walls is unknown. Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. During the decade-long excavation beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the Vatican's archaeologists expected to find graves, and they did, dozens of them, ranging from humble cremation niches to ornate mausolea built for wealthy Roman families. But what they did not anticipate was the degree of confusion surrounding the human remains scattered through the necropolis. Some of the bones unearthed were precisely where they should have been, laid in tombs accompanied by inscriptions, mosaics, or offerings. Others, however, were not. Mixed remains appeared in strange places, stuffed behind walls, hidden in sealed cavities, or piled beneath broken paving stones. It soon became clear that the Vatican's underground held more than just Christian dead. Several of the remains analyzed during the scavi belonged to women, children, and even animals, some of them without any clear connection to a grave. In one case, a cluster of bones was found beneath the red wall near the so-called Trophy of Gaius. These bones were examined by anthropologist Venerando Correnti and were initially dismissed as insignificant, until Professor Margherita Guarducci reviewed the analysis and discovered anomalies in the report. The bones had been gathered from multiple points, some of them not properly documented. Worse, some showed signs of post-mortem handling. They had clearly been moved after burial, and not just once. The most famous case involved the box of bones found wrapped in expensive cloth with golden thread, discovered in a cavity behind the red wall. Though these were later presented as the possible remains of St. Peter, it was never fully explained why they had been separated from the original grave. Even more troubling were the bones quietly excluded from public reports, skeletal fragments that didn't match the age, sex, or ethnic origin expected from a first-century Roman cemetery. One fragment, according to internal memos leaked decades later, showed characteristics consistent with a North African male in early adulthood. Another showed signs of trauma inconsistent with natural death. These were not statistical oddities. They were indicators of something else, perhaps secondary burials, perhaps relic theft, perhaps even an attempt to sanitize the necropolis narrative. The Vatican's position has always been one of reverence and restraint, but the bones that don't belong challenge that restraint. They raise questions the Church has long preferred remain buried. Who else lies beneath the Basilica, and why were they hidden? Among the lesser-known artifacts recovered from the depths of the Vatican necropolis, one object stands apart, not for its beauty, but for the question it poses. It is a key, forged of iron and coated in a thin layer of corrosion, discovered in a deteriorated cloth bundle within a small, unmarked tomb near the eastern boundary of the burial field. The tomb itself bore no inscriptions, but the bundle had been carefully tucked into a corner recess, beneath shards of broken ceramic and traces of wax. When conservators first examined the key in the 1950s, they assumed it to be a simple personal belonging, perhaps a household item or symbolic funerary token. But later metallurgical analysis revealed a surprising detail. The design of the key's teeth and the craftsmanship of its grip aligned not with Roman or early Christian styles, but with the standard forms used during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, specifically the period of the Crusades. Its design bore similarities to keys recovered from Templar sites in Acre and Antioch. Further intrigue came with a small copper tag affixed to a degraded strip of leather found near the key. The tag bore a faint engraving, a cross pate enclosed within a circle, a symbol commonly associated with the Knights Templar. Though the Vatican has never officially confirmed the object's presence in their collection, two scholars, one Italian, one French, independently recorded its existence during restricted visits to the Apostolic Repository in the 1980s. Their findings suggest that the key may not have originated in Rome at all, but was deliberately brought there and buried with intention. Why would a Crusader key be hidden in a Roman tomb beneath the Basilica? One theory holds that it was part of a secret reliquary, perhaps linked to a mission undertaken by certain Templar knights to safeguard artifacts or documents during the suppression of their order in the early 14th century. Another suggests it was ceremonial, a symbolic act of passing guardianship from one generation of defenders to another. But no record exists of a knight being interred beneath St. Peter's, no ceremony, no marker, no rite. The key remains silent, rusted, and still. It fits no known lock within the Vatican's official archives, and yet its very presence suggests a door once existed, or still does, that someone, long ago, sought to guard or to seal. Carved into the walls of the Vatican necropolis are words that speak across centuries, messages scratched by trembling hands, chiseled with reverence or desperation, and sometimes painted in bold defiance of erasure. Most are in Latin or Greek, the familiar tongues of empire and early liturgy. They speak of peace, hope, and eternal rest. Some invoke Christ, others the apostles. But among these familiar inscriptions, scattered across certain mausolea and in the dimmer corners of sealed tombs, are fragments of a language no one has conclusively identified. The first of these enigmatic markings was noted during the original scavi, carved into the side of a modest burial chamber near the presumed tomb of Peter. The inscription, faded but legible, contains what appear to be phonetic symbols not consistent with Latin script. One fragment reads, Zareth Elosoth, a phrase that does not match known biblical, Roman, or Greek usage. At first, the phrase was dismissed as gibberish or damage until similar markings turned up in other nearby tombs, each time near crosses or depictions of fish, symbols associated with early Christianity. Some scholars proposed that these were remnants of a lost Judaic Christian dialect, possibly Aramaic, transliterated into Latin letters. Others suggested they may reflect a secret liturgical language, spoken only among the earliest initiates of the faith, meant to obscure sacred messages from Roman authorities. But the pattern suggests something stranger. In one tomb wall, the inscriptions appear to follow a rhythm, almost like a chant or invocation. Repetition of phrases, broken by unfamiliar glyphs, suggest a structured form of communication, not graffiti but ritual language. There is no definitive interpretation. The Vatican has made no public statement on the anomalous scripts, and few scholars have been granted access to re-examine the sites in question. In 1974, a private researcher named Anton Schaefer claimed the inscriptions mirrored early Gnostic incantations found in Nag Hammadi manuscripts, linking them to sects deemed heretical by the early Church. If that's true, the inscriptions could represent voices the Church sought to bury, not just physically, but theologically. A belief system exiled not through argument, but through silence. Whether prayer, protest, or warning, the language of the dead lingers beneath St. Peter's, unreadable but unmistakably human, echoing through stone, time, and secrecy. Among the many papal tombs housed beneath St. Peter's Basilica, one stands out not for its grandeur but for its omission. The sarcophagus of Pope Stephen VI, interred quietly in the early 10th century, bears a Latin inscription that speaks of virtue, justice, and fidelity to the apostolic tradition. It praises his unshakable service to the See of Peter and his holy restoration of ecclesial purity. But anyone familiar with the dark history of Stephen VI knows that these words are not only misleading, they are a calculated deception. Stephen is remembered by most historians not for piety, but for the Cadaver Synod of 897, an event so grotesque it still stands as one of the most surreal moments in papal history. During his brief and tumultuous reign, Stephen ordered the exhumation of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, whose corpse had been buried for several months. The body was dressed in papal vestments, propped up on a throne, and placed on trial in the Lateran Basilica. A deacon was assigned to speak on behalf of the decomposing Formosus, while Stephen presided, shouting accusations of perjury, heresy, and ambition. The corpse was found guilty. Stephen then ordered the 3 fingers Formosus had used for blessings to be cut off, his papal garments torn away, and his body thrown into the Tiber River. This act of ritual desecration shocked even a medieval audience accustomed to brutal spectacle. Riots soon followed. Within months, Stephen was deposed, imprisoned, and strangled to death in his cell. Yet none of this horror is mentioned on his tomb. There is no reference to the Cadaver Synod, no hint of scandal, no trace of violence. Instead, the inscription offers a portrait of humble service. It is as if the stone itself is lying. Some historians believe the tomb was restored or recut by a later pope eager to rehabilitate the image of the office. Others suggest that Vatican scribes deliberately altered funeral records to obscure the episode, but the silence of the stone is telling. In a church that places immense value on memory and continuity, Stephen VI's tomb represents a deliberate rewriting, a papal lie chiseled into marble and buried beneath a basilica that claims to honor truth. There is a section beneath St. Peter's Basilica that few speak of, even within Vatican circles. Tucked behind sealed doors and narrow brick corridors, beyond the public grottos where pilgrims leave flowers and prayers, lies a vaulted chamber unofficially known among a handful of archivists as the Gallery of the Lost. It is not marked on tourist maps. It is not included in official Vatican tours, and yet it holds the remains of several men who once claimed the throne of Peter. Some of these popes reigned in times of such turbulence and corruption that the Church later chose to forget them. Others were anti-popes, elected during schisms or imperial conflicts, their legitimacy debated for centuries. Over time, the Vatican quietly relocated some of their remains from more prominent tombs into this anonymous vault, a gesture of uneasy reconciliation between memory and shame. Among those interred here is Pope John XII, who ascended to the papacy at age 18 in the mid-10th century and ruled more like a Roman prince than a spiritual leader. His papacy was marred by accusations of murder, simony, and scandalous behavior inside the Lateran palace. Chroniclers claimed he turned the papal residence into a brothel and invoked pagan gods during gambling rituals. His sudden death, possibly the result of a jealous husband's revenge, left the Church scrambling to explain the loss of a man who should never have worn the tiara. Another body believed to rest in the vault belongs to Pope Benedict IX, who sold the papacy, not once, but possibly twice, and was excommunicated multiple times over the course of his long, erratic career. The official papal record refers to him vaguely as having abdicated under pressure, and yet his bones remain within the sacred footprint of the Basilica, far from view, in a chamber whose location is whispered rather than acknowledged. The vault's stones are undecorated, the names barely inscribed. Here the past is not displayed, it is silenced. The Church did not disinter these men in rage or sanctify them in forgiveness. Instead, it entombed them in anonymity, neither condemned nor revered, just sealed away in a space where scandal can no longer speak. Today, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica appears immovable, a monumental crown of the Renaissance, rising over the Vatican skyline like the heavens rendered in stone. But there was a moment, long after Michelangelo's death, when the very weight of that dome threatened to destroy the church beneath it. The problem was not merely aesthetic or symbolic, it was structural. When Michelangelo took over the basilica's design in 1546, he conceived the dome as a double-shell masterpiece, inspired by Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, but meant to surpass it in scale and gravity. He completed the design and the drum before his death in 1564, but the actual construction of the dome fell to Giacomo della Porta and Domenico Fontana. It was raised swiftly in the 1580s, a marvel of speed and ambition. Yet, over the centuries, cracks began to appear. Subtle at first, hairline fractures in the masonry, shifting joints, vibrations. By the 18th century, engineers noticed visible fissures along the supporting piers. The massive pressure of the dome, concentrated on 4 central pillars, was slowly deforming the stone beneath. In 1742, Pope Benedict XIV quietly commissioned a survey by the architect Luigi Vanvitelli, whose report alarmed even seasoned builders. Vanvitelli warned that if corrective measures were not taken, the weight of the dome could cause one or more of the pillars to buckle, initiating a cascade of collapse. The Vatican did not announce this threat publicly. Instead, internal records show a flurry of reinforcement work. Iron chains embedded within the dome's base, masonry injections into weakened joints, and the quiet installation of tension rods. These interventions were designed not only to stabilize the structure, but to keep the faithful from ever realizing how close the sacred space came to catastrophe. Even today, the dome is monitored constantly, its weight pressing down on history with an intensity no visitor can truly perceive from below. Engineers inspect it with modern tools, measuring micro-movements invisible to the eye. The Vatican seldom speaks of this narrow escape, preferring to emphasize the dome's majesty rather than its fragility. But for those who understand the mechanics of stone and time, St. Peter's Dome is not just a triumph, it is a burden, an awe-inspiring risk carried by generations and one breath away from disaster. In the spring of 1983, a boy named Emanuela Orlandi vanished from the streets of Rome, just a short walk from Vatican City. Her disappearance became one of Italy's most enduring mysteries, tangled in a web of theories involving everything from international espionage to organized crime. But fewer people know that a second disappearance occurred that same year, even closer to the heart of the Vatican. The boy's name was never released publicly. What is known, drawn from fragments of internal Vatican correspondence and whispered accounts from former choir members, is that a young singer from the Sistine Chapel choir went missing under circumstances so peculiar they were buried beneath layers of silence. The child had been a rising talent, praised for his clarity of voice and ease with complex Latin chants. He lived within the Vatican walls, one of the few minors granted full-time residence due to his musical duties. On a rainy morning in October, he failed to appear at rehearsal. No formal announcement was made. Choir members were told he had fallen ill and been sent home. Yet some noticed that his belongings remained in his small dormitory. Sheet music still sat on his desk. His vestments were folded, untouched. When asked about his whereabouts, the choir master reportedly grew cold, ending the discussion with the phrase, "Let the matter rest." Years later, an internal memo surfaced, undated, unsigned, citing a security concern involving a minor guest within the Cappella Sistina housing. The wording was vague, but it coincided with a period of quiet internal restructuring in the Vatican's administrative offices. No police report was filed with Italian authorities. No name appeared in public registers. For decades, the case was simply not acknowledged. Some former choir boys, now grown, recall hushed warnings about certain stairwells to avoid, certain doors never to knock on. In 2019, when investigators briefly opened 2 Vatican tombs in search of Emanuela Orlandi's remains, conspiracy theories swirled anew, but no one mentioned the other missing child. His name, his story, his song, all gone. In a place where every voice is said to rise toward heaven, his was the one that fell silent, never to return. Inside the north transept of St. Peter's Basilica, past a row of chapels rarely noticed by tourists, there is a column of travertine that has attracted quiet curiosity for centuries. Known informally as the Whispering Wall, it possesses a curious acoustic anomaly. A person standing close and speaking at a certain pitch can be heard distinctly several meters away, through solid marble, by someone standing at the wall's opposite end. Sound engineers have since confirmed the effect, attributing it to the column's curvature, surface polish, and the tight geometry of the surrounding walls. But centuries before acoustics had a name, this wall was treated not as a marvel, but as a secret. In the late 1600s, a Benedictine monk named Father Aurelio Montalto began conducting discreet observations from the side chapel nearest the wall. A skilled scribe and Vatican librarian, Montalto noticed that when high-ranking clerics met nearby, their private conversations often carried through the marble, words bouncing gently along the column's surface until they reached the unsuspecting ear. Montalto began recording fragments, some of them deeply personal, others politically volatile. Over time, his notes grew into a ledger, passages of whispered guilt, theological doubt, and papal schemes. One such entry allegedly details a conversation between two cardinals plotting to discredit a rival during the conclave of 1689. Another speaks of secret payments made to secure votes in the papal election. Montalto wrote in cipher, carefully hiding his volumes in the base of a reliquary cabinet under his care. His writings were never meant to be found, but in 1928, during a renovation of the library's east wing, a hidden compartment was discovered containing pages of parchment with fragmented Latin inscriptions and marginal diagrams of architectural spaces, including the Whispering Wall. Modern archivists studied the pages, and while some were dismissed as devotional reflections, others hinted at a far more deliberate surveillance effort. There's no record of disciplinary action against Montalto, and no formal acknowledgement of the Whispering Wall's function. But his scribbles remain, a trace of one man who listened while power believed itself unheard. Today, the wall still stands. Most walk past it, unaware. But if you stop, lean close, and whisper, you might just hear something answer back. Tucked within the Apostolic Palace, just behind a narrow corridor seldom shown on official Vatican tours, is a suite of rooms known simply as Camera 12. At first glance, there is nothing unusual about it. High vaulted ceilings, faded frescoes of saints and martyrs, a writing desk near a window overlooking the courtyard. And yet, for over a century, no cardinal has occupied the room for more than a few months at a time. It has become a quiet superstition among Vatican insiders. Camera 12 is not to be requested. It is only ever assigned, and never for long. The pattern first emerged during the late 19th century when Cardinal Alphonse de la Roche, a French theologian and advisor to Pope Leo XIII, was found dead inside the room under strange circumstances. The official report cited apoplexy, but notes from the attending physician mentioned signs of acute cardiac distress and deep scratches along the cardinal's forearms, as though he had been trying to claw something unseen. The room was sealed for nearly 20 years. When it reopened in the 1920s, a Polish cardinal assigned to the suite requested reassignment within 2 weeks, complaining of sleeplessness and whispers that echoed from the walls after midnight. Other clerics would report similar disturbances, prayers recited backward in the dark, flickering candle flames without a draft, the sound of pacing when no one was present. Vatican maintenance crews investigated the suite on several occasions, but found nothing structurally unusual, and yet the room continued to unsettle. In the 1950s, an internal memorandum suggested converting it into storage space, but the proposal was vetoed without explanation. Since then, Camera 12 has been quietly rotated through temporary occupants, usually visitors from abroad or auxiliary bishops passing through Rome. Some claim the room is cursed, a site of unconfessed sin or spiritual breach. Others believe it holds a secret archive, long removed, whose memory still haunts the space. Whatever its origin, the room's reputation remains. No name is carved on the door. No occupant stays long. In the heart of a palace that prides itself on eternal continuity, Camera 12 reminds its few visitors that even within sacred walls, some places are simply not meant to be inhabited. In the summer of 1978, the Catholic world was stunned when Pope Paul VI died and was quickly succeeded by a man known for his warmth, humility, and simplicity, Albino Luciani, Pope John Paul I. His papacy, however, would last only 33 days. The official Vatican narrative claimed he died of a heart attack in his sleep, found still clutching a sheaf of sermon notes. Yet from the moment the news broke, the inconsistencies began to surface. The time of death was revised multiple times. The nun who discovered the body was never officially acknowledged. The absence of an autopsy, even under the relaxed protocols of the Church, stirred suspicion. But what few realize is that Luciani's vanishing act was not his first. The second time he left the world. The first time he disappeared from view within the Vatican itself. During the second week of his papacy, Pope John Paul I abruptly canceled all scheduled audiences for nearly 36 hours. Vatican press officials stated he was in personal retreat, but several sources within the Curia later claimed that the Pope had left his private quarters during the early morning hours and had not been seen by any of his personal staff until the evening of the next day. No written statement from him survives from that missing window. One Swiss guard, speaking decades later under anonymity, suggested the Pope had descended into the crypt beneath the Basilica, a visit that was neither recorded nor accompanied by the usual security detail. Another rumor, whispered by a former Vatican archivist, claims Luciani had demanded access to files stored in the sealed section of the Apostolic Archive, including documents from the reign of Pope Pius XII concerning wartime financial transactions. These requests were denied. The next week he was dead. Some believe his death was natural and unfortunate. Others claim it was orchestrated to prevent reform or the unsealing of long-protected secrets. What remains undeniable is this: a pope disappeared twice, once from the public, once from life, and in both cases, silence followed. To this day, no official cause of death has ever been confirmed by an independent authority. And beneath the marble floor of the Basilica, Luciani's tomb remains quiet, unvisited, unexamined, a monument not to memory, but to vanishing. In 1992, during the reorganization of a minor Vatican office in the Fabbrica di San Pietro, the department responsible for the maintenance and architectural preservation of St. Peter's Basilica, a rolled parchment was discovered wedged behind a cabinet, sealed in a brass tube long oxidized by time. At first, it appeared to be one of many duplicates of Michelangelo's architectural sketches, but once unrolled and examined under low light, it was clear this was something else entirely. The parchment displayed a full architectural blueprint of the basilica, annotated in Latin and Old Italian, but overlaid with corridors, chambers, and staircases that do not exist in the modern structure. This version of St. Peter's was impossibly vast, descending multiple levels underground, with entire crypt systems labeled with designations like NEV7 Confessio Secreta and Porta Umbrarum, the Gate of Shadows. The most jarring element, however, was a chamber positioned directly beneath the central altar, marked only with a symbol, a black sun enclosed in a ring of thorns. The document was unsigned, but a faded watermark in the lower margin revealed a date, 1607, the year when Carlo Maderno took over architectural duties from Michelangelo's successors. For years, art historians had assumed Maderno's work focused solely on extending the nave and completing the basilica's facade. But the blueprint suggests that Maderno may have been involved in, or at least aware of, plans for an expanded subterranean complex that was never built. Or perhaps it was built and then concealed. The official story is that the blueprint was filed with the archive and dismissed as a conceptual sketch. But one former staff member who worked with the Fabbrica's conservation team in the 1990s claimed that the blueprint was immediately removed from their custody and taken to a sealed compartment within the Apostolic Archive. No further copies have been shown to researchers. Speculation erupted in private circles. Was the blueprint a fantasy, a code, or a record of something the Church had buried both physically and historically? No one can say. What remains is the question itself. How much of St. Peter's is visible to the world, and how much was designed never to be found? The blueprint rests in silence now, unseen, its contours drawn in ink and secrecy, charting a version of the Vatican the world was never meant to inherit. Among the thousands of relics catalogued within the Vatican's vaults, there is one artifact that has eluded both confirmation and denial for centuries: a long, narrow shard of what appears to be ancient olive wood, encased in a Byzantine reliquary of gilded copper and glass, marked simply with the Latin phrase crux veritatis, the cross of truth. Unlike the many known fragments of the true cross, which are venerated in cathedrals and chapels across Europe, this relic is kept in near total obscurity. It is not listed in the Index Reliquiarum, the Church's official registry of sacred remains. It has never been displayed. Its existence is known only through a brief handwritten note from the early 18th century, discovered among the private papers of Cardinal Prospero Lambertini, who would later become Pope Benedict XIV. Lambertini was renowned for his insistence on rigorous authentication of relics, often dismissing dubious ones, even at the cost of public scandal. In his note, dated 1728, he describes examining a reliquary that had surfaced in the collection of a defunct Benedictine abbey near Ravenna. The monks claimed it had been smuggled out of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Unlike other fragments, this one bore a faint but deliberate inscription in Greek. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. The Aramaic words Christ is said to have cried from the cross, according to the Gospel of Matthew. Lambertini's note ends abruptly. There is no record of the relic being officially recognized, condemned, or catalogued. But in 1951, during a discreet reorganization of Vatican holdings overseen by Monsignor Tardini, a reliquary matching Lambertini's description was reportedly transferred to a restricted storage room beneath the sacristy of St. Peter's. Scholars who have requested access have been denied without explanation. Some believe the relic's inscription is a forgery, others that its provenance was too deeply entwined with the looting of Constantinople to risk its validation. But the deeper fear, whispered among theologians, is that the inscription itself may not have been carved by a believer, but by someone who witnessed the event, someone present at Golgotha who left behind not just wood but memory. If the relic is real, its silence may protect something more than history. It may guard the Church from a truth too direct to canonize. Tucked deep within the Vatican's apostolic archive lies a letter so quietly profound that even seasoned archivists speak of it with caution. Dated October 11th, 1913, 11 months before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand ignited the First World War. The letter was written by Cardinal Mariano Rampolla del Tindaro, former Vatican Secretary of State and one-time papal contender. The document is addressed not to a head of state nor to the Pope, but to an anonymous brother of the East, presumed by some to be an Orthodox patriarch or a high-ranking figure within the Russian Church. What makes the letter remarkable is not only its literary precision, but the clarity with which it forecasts the unraveling of Europe. Rampolla writes of a coming storm that will begin in a corner of empire, driven by secret treaties, mechanized death, and a new theology of nationalism disguised as divine destiny. He warns that the Church will be tested, that crowns will fall, and that millions of young men will die without ever knowing why. The blood of Sarajevo, he writes, shall be but the first ink spilled upon a manuscript of fire. How could he have known? Some believe Rampolla, a deeply intellectual and esoterically inclined figure, had access to diplomatic cables no longer preserved in official archives. Others suspect he drew on prophecy, either his own interpretations of apocalyptic scripture or older church predictions suppressed from public liturgy. The letter vanished for decades after Rampolla's death in 1913, only resurfacing in 1957 during a routine inventory of sealed papal correspondence. Since then, it has been stored in a climate-controlled drawer within a special containment wing known as the Archivum Prophetarum, where letters, visions, and unexplained missives are quietly preserved away from theological scrutiny. The Vatican has never issued a statement regarding the letter's contents. Copies are not permitted. Only a handful of scholars have been allowed to read it in person, and all have signed non-disclosure agreements. But every few years, a rumor leaks of its tone, its accuracy, its final paragraph. It ends, allegedly, with this: "The smoke of war shall rise first from men, and then from heaven. When the church forgets the dust shall remind her." Beneath the mosaic floor of St. Peter's Basilica lies a sealed crypt so obscure it does not appear on any official blueprint. Most visitors, even those granted access to the scavi, will never pass near it. But among a small circle of Vatican custodians, there persists the quiet legend of the lunaris sepulchrum, the moonlight crypt. The name does not refer to any lunar symbolism carved into the stone, nor to any relic contained within. Instead, it references the peculiar fact that the crypt appears accessible only during specific lunar alignments, when shafts of pale moonlight, entering through hidden apertures in the basilica's architecture, trigger the mechanism that unseals its threshold. The earliest mention of the moonlight crypt dates back to a set of handwritten notes from 1629, composed by a Swiss architect working under Gian Lorenzo Bernini during the design of the baldachin above St. Peter's tomb. In a side margin, the architect scribbled, "Beware the eastward well that does not open under sun." This phrase was dismissed as metaphor until the early 20th century, when a Jesuit historian researching the orientation of ancient churches noted that a certain stairwell behind the chapel of St. Longinus exhibited unusual magnetic anomalies, especially during full moons near the equinox. Further investigation was halted by Vatican officials without public explanation. In 1972, during electrical maintenance under the nave, 2 workmen allegedly discovered a hollow chamber behind a blocked corridor. The room was lined in white stone, unusually smooth, and at its center stood a sarcophagus, unlike any other in the Vatican, carved with astronomical constellations and inscriptions in a blend of Latin and Syriac. The lid was sealed with iron bands, but the workmen reported that it shifted slightly as a beam of moonlight filtered through a slit in the masonry. Before they could examine further, they were dismissed and reassigned. Today, the lunaris sepulchrum remains a subject of whispers. Some believe it houses a forgotten pope excommunicated from memory. Others say it conceals heretical gospels buried during the purge of early Christian sects. But no one speaks of it openly, not in the basilica, not in the archives, and certainly not under a full moon, when the light finds its ancient path and the dust shifts quietly in the dark. In the southern transept of St. Peter's Basilica, tucked high above the heads of passers-by near the altar of St. Joseph, is a mosaic so refined, so detailed in its brushless precision, that it has long been mistaken for a painting. Depicting a solitary figure draped in deep red robes, seated beneath an arch of stars, the artwork bears no title, no signature, and no formal record of commission. Vatican art historians refer to it, when they mention it at all, as inconcessus, the unpermitted. Its colors shimmer even in low light, and the face of the figure, though serene, carries an expression that many visitors describe as unsettling, not malevolent, but aware, as if the mosaic is not an object to behold, but one that beholds in return. The origins of this mosaic are a puzzle that even the Vatican's most meticulous archivists have failed to solve. It does not appear in any of the master inventory scrolls kept by the Fabbrica di San Pietro, which have logged nearly every inch of art, marble, and metal in the basilica since the 17th century. Nor does it bear the stylistic fingerprint of the known mosaicists employed by the Vatican in the 18th or 19th centuries. The tesserae, the tiny tiles that make up the image, are of a type not quarried in Italy or known to modern supply chains. When a sliver was tested by an external expert during a quiet restoration in the 1980s, It was found to contain a silicate compound unknown to contemporary geology, fused at a temperature far higher than traditional kilns could achieve. Who installed it and when remains a mystery. Some Vatican guides, if asked directly, suggest it may have been the work of a forgotten apprentice, a devotional piece created in private. But others, particularly among the archivists, whisper a different theory, that inconcessus was not added but revealed, that beneath centuries of plaster, fresco, and gilding, the mosaic had always been there, waiting. A fragment from an earlier chapel, perhaps even a proto-basilica that predated Constantine's original church on the Vatican Hill. Whatever its source, one thing is clear: the church has chosen not to highlight it. It is not illuminated by spotlights. It is not featured in guidebooks. It simply watches from a darkened corner above the altar, outside of time. In the undercroft of St. Peter's Basilica, where corridors narrow and the air turns cool with the breath of centuries, there exists a doorway sealed with molten lead. Unlike other crypt doors marked by dates, Latin inscriptions, or coats of arms, this one bears only a single mark, a palm-sized imprint of a fisherman's ring pressed deep into the metal before it hardened. The seal, believed to date to the mid-15th century, remains unbroken. No attempt has ever been made to open it, not during papal renovations, not during the post-war restorations, not even during the ambitious archaeological excavations of the 1940s that uncovered the supposed tomb of St. Peter himself. It is, in the words of one Vatican conservator, a door we are meant to know about but never pass through. Archival references to the seal are few. The earliest mention comes from a 1471 inventory drawn up under Pope Sixtus IV, who oversaw major building efforts across Rome. The document describes a vault of silence, sealed in perpetuity under the sign of the ring. It makes no mention of contents, no relics, no bones, no treasury, merely a warning: non appariatur nisi voce angelica, let it not be opened except by angelic voice. Some interpret this as poetic allegory, a typical flourish of Renaissance religious language. Others suggest it is far more literal. In 1974, a structural engineer conducting routine soundings in the undercroft recorded faint hollows behind the sealed wall. Ground-penetrating radar, later employed during a discrete survey in 2002, confirmed the presence of a chamber measuring approximately 6 by 8 meters. The interior showed no obvious objects or sarcophagi, only a central elevation, circular in form, possibly a pedestal or altar. But when a proposal was submitted to the Secretariat of State requesting permission for exploratory entry, it was denied within 24 hours. No reason was given. A second proposal, submitted 3 years later, was never acknowledged at all. Among those who study the unseen, the sealed door has become an object of deep fascination. Some believe it hides early apostolic writings deemed too radical for canon law. Others suspect it contains a casket unfit for sanctification, perhaps the remains of someone revered before the rise of orthodoxy. But the most haunting theory is also the simplest, that the seal is a test, not of curiosity, but of obedience, a boundary drawn not by mortar and metal, but by silence. Every visitor to St. Peter's Basilica passes by tombs, marble slabs underfoot, bronze statues resting in side chapels, gilded sarcophagi sealed beneath centuries of reverence. Each name is known, each epitaph recorded. But among these tributes to papal legacy, one tomb lies with no inscription, no seal, no visible sign of its occupant. Positioned along the western nave, embedded in the floor like any other anonymous stone, this slab is smoother than most, worn by thousands of footsteps each day. It is unmarked by design, and according to an internal Vatican memorandum dated 1911, it holds the body of a pope the Church no longer speaks of, Pope Sylvester III. Elected in 1045 during a time of profound corruption and factional violence within the Roman Curia, Sylvester III's pontificate lasted less than a month. Historians disagree over whether his election was legitimate, coerced, or purely symbolic. He was deposed shortly after by Benedict IX, who returned to reclaim the throne he had previously sold. Sylvester retreated to his former bishopric, but his fate remained murky. Later documents from the 11th century claim he was excommunicated. Others assert he quietly returned to Rome and died in obscurity. The Church, caught between its need for continuity and its fear of scandal, removed his name from formal liturgies. He became an ecclesiastical ghost, neither fully pope nor fully apostate. The 1911 memo, penned by a junior archivist tasked with reviewing medieval burial records, makes a cryptic reference to a pontiff interred without name under the nave on account of ecclesiastical contradiction. While the note does not explicitly name Sylvester III, it aligns with descriptions found in a 15th century funeral registry that mentions a Bishop of Rome, unnamed by order of canon. In 1958, a group of scholars requested permission to conduct a discrete ground analysis of the location. They were denied. When the floor was replaced in that section during routine maintenance in the 1980s, the stone was left untouched. Why preserve the tomb and not the name? Some believe the Vatican hopes silence will erase memory. Others think the Church recognizes, in its own way, the tragic burden of power misused and forgotten. So the stone remains, plain, silent, uncelebrated, yet walked upon by pilgrims every day. Beneath it, perhaps, lies a man who wore the papal tiara for mere days, but carries in death the full weight of an erased identity. In the waning years of World War II, as bombs fell across Italy and the world reeled from moral and political collapse, Pope Pius XII maintained a quiet circle of advisors behind the Vatican's protected walls. Among them was a man whose name rarely appears in official accounts, Dr. Riccardo Galeazzi Lisi, the Pope's personal physician. A skilled medical professional and longtime Vatican insider, Galeazzi Lisi was not merely a caretaker of the Pope's physical health. He became, for a brief and controversial time, the custodian of his death. What followed would earn him infamy and exile. Yet hidden beneath that public disgrace lies a more peculiar tale, one of forbidden burial and institutional memory that refuses to fade. When Pope Pius XII died in Castel Gandolfo in 1958, Galeazzi Lisi took it upon himself to embalm the pontiff's body using a highly unorthodox method. He claimed it was an ancient formula involving herbs and essential oils designed to preserve the pope without the need for traditional chemicals. The result was catastrophic. Within days, the corpse began to decompose visibly during public veneration. The Vatican quickly moved to remove Galeazzi Lisi from his post, barring him from papal service and sealing his files. But what happened to the doctor himself after that was quietly erased from the official record. Galeazzi Lisi died in 1968. The obituary released by the Holy See was terse and devoid of ceremony. No mention was made of funeral arrangements or interment. But decades later, during an audit of burial records in the German college section of the Teutonic Cemetery, a small, ancient graveyard nestled just outside St. Peter's Basilica, an anonymous ossuary stone was found bearing the initials RGL, tucked between two bishops from the late 19th century. The grave was not catalogued. No permission had ever been issued. Yet the records indicate a burial took place one night under cover of darkness, with only 2 witnesses present, both later transferred to posts abroad. Why would the Vatican permit the burial of a disgraced figure within such sacred proximity? Some believe the decision was made in secret by a sympathetic cardinal. Others whisper that Galeazzi Lisi carried documents or knowledge too sensitive to risk public fallout. Whatever the reason, his bones now rest within the Vatican's own ground, beneath a stone without a name, beneath a story half told and still disquieting. In the spring of 1976, a man named Matteo Fabbri arrived in Rome from a quiet village near Assisi. He was in his late 60s, wiry and weathered, with the gait of someone who had walked more than he had ridden. Fabbri claimed he was on pilgrimage, a journey of faith to see the tomb of St. Peter and to confess a burden he had carried for decades. At first, his story was unremarkable. Every day, pilgrims stream through St. Peter's Square with prayers, journals, and the hope of reconciliation. But Fabbri was different. He didn't follow the guided routes or linger in the Basilica. Instead, he asked specific questions about underground passages, about ancient records, about the patterns carved into the marble floors. He stayed for hours in the archives, requesting documents rarely consulted even by scholars, and within days, whispers began to circulate through the halls of the Vatican. This man was not simply a pilgrim. He was searching for something. What few knew then, and what later came to light, was that Fabbri had served as a low-level custodian in the Vatican's archival department during the turbulent years of the Second World War. He had been dismissed in 1943 under vague accusations of mishandling documents, but had kept a series of journals detailing his duties. According to fragments later recovered, Fabbri claimed to have seen sealed boxes labeled with ancient sigils and Hebrew script removed from beneath the Vatican library during a blackout. He believed they were part of a pre-Christian collection hidden by the Church, relics too politically or theologically explosive to surface in any papal century. After the war, he returned to his village, convinced that what he had witnessed was connected to deeper truths long buried beneath St. Peter's. His return in 1976 was meant to confirm these beliefs, perhaps to expose them. But after 10 days of inquiries, Fabbri disappeared. His last confirmed sighting was inside the Basilica just after closing, speaking with a Swiss guard near the Chapel of the Sacrament. No official investigation was launched. His room at the Pilgrim Hostel remained undisturbed, his belongings intact, his journals gone. The Church made no statement. Some believe he died quietly, buried in the Vatican gardens without a name. Others think he was escorted away, perhaps even protected. But the trail ends with silence. Like so many before him, Matteo Fabbri came looking for truth, and in the shadows of the dome he found only the quiet that waits for those who look too closely. In the spring of 2001, while cataloging numismatic donations from a defunct Roman monastery, a Vatican curator uncovered a coin unlike any previously recorded in church or imperial history. Roughly the size of a modern euro, the object bore the unmistakable likeness of a pope, mitre-crowned, seated, one hand raised in benediction. But around the edge of the coin, in fine Latin script, was a name that had never appeared in any ecclesiastical registry: Pontifex Petrus Secundus, Pope Peter II. This alone would have been a scandal. According to Catholic doctrine, no pope may ever take the name Peter II out of reverence for the apostle and the Church's foundation. The number is a theological impossibility. And yet, here it was, struck into metal. The reverse of the coin depicted the traditional keys of St. Peter crossed behind a globe, but above them hovered an unfamiliar symbol, an 8-pointed star encased in a serpent devouring its own tail. Experts first assumed it was a forgery, but metallurgical analysis revealed a coinage method consistent with early Renaissance minting, using a composition of silver and tin, unique to a period between 1450 and 1480. No known counterfeiter had the materials or knowledge to replicate it so precisely. Moreover, the style matched none of the Vatican's known metallists. When the coin was shown discreetly to a retired Jesuit historian, he allegedly responded with a single phrase: "It was not meant for circulation." Some believe the coin was produced as part of a secret conclave, perhaps during one of the Church's many schisms, by a faction anticipating a catastrophic rupture in the line of succession. Others suggest it commemorates an apocalyptic prophecy, that in a time of global crisis, the Church would install a final pope bearing the forbidden name, marking the end of the temporal order and the beginning of divine reckoning. References to Peter the Roman, the final pope in the controversial prophecy of the popes attributed to Saint Malachi, were quickly and quietly suppressed in connection with the coin's discovery. The object now resides in a sealed Vatican drawer, unlisted in public exhibitions. Those who have seen it say the engraving is exquisite and unnerving, not because of the craftsmanship, but because the eyes of Pope Peter II seem to follow the viewer, not with blessing, but with recognition, as if the face is not imagining the future, but remembering it. In the summer of 1939, as Europe teetered on the edge of war, Vatican staff began to notice a peculiar occurrence in the apostolic gardens behind St. Peter's Basilica. At dusk, just before the lamps were lit, a figure robed in white would sometimes be seen walking alone along the gravel paths, head bowed, hands clasped, unmistakably papal in dress and posture. At first, few questioned it. Pope Pius XII, newly elected and known for his solemnity, often walked in contemplation. But confusion set in when multiple staff members reported seeing the pontiff in his private apartments during these very strolls. On more than one occasion, he was observed reading or meeting with advisors at the same hour his likeness appeared in the gardens. Swiss guards, when dispatched to investigate, found nothing. The figure would vanish into hedgerows or disappear behind ancient walls, but the reports continued. Then, in a rare moment of internal candor, an elderly Monsignor confided to a young seminarian that the phenomenon had occurred before, during the final months of Pope Leo XIII's life in 1903. At the time, the duplicate was referred to in whispers as Umbra Petri, the shadow of Peter. Not a ghost, but something more complicated, a living echo, a manifestation tied not to one man, but to the office of the papacy itself. In 1943, as Allied bombs struck Rome and the Vatican's diplomatic neutrality hung by a thread, Pius XII reportedly spoke privately with his confessor about the double. He described a night when, unable to sleep, he walked the garden paths himself, only to see a robed figure approaching from the opposite end. When the two neared each other, the double stopped, placed a hand over its heart, and bowed. The Pope returned the gesture. Neither spoke. Moments later, the figure turned and vanished into the trees. That night, Pius reportedly made a cryptic entry in his diary: "The burden of Peter walks beside me. May it never pass ahead." After the war, sightings faded, but in 1978, following the death of John Paul I, a gardener claimed he saw two white-robed men walking silently together along the colonnade's edge. Only one was ever seen entering the basilica. The other disappeared into the shadows behind the fountain. To this day, Vatican records neither confirm nor deny the presence of the Umbra Petri. But among those who serve the papal household, there lingers a quiet understanding. The office of the Pope may belong to one man, but it casts a reflection too vast for a single soul. In 1959, during a restoration survey of the Vatican grottos beneath St. Peter's Basilica, a team of archivists and stonemasons were assigned to inspect the tomb of Pope Julius II, the formidable Renaissance pope who commissioned Michelangelo and sought to cement his legacy in marble and bronze. Though Julius II's grand mausoleum, envisioned by Michelangelo, was never completed as designed, his burial site beneath the basilica remained a modest but well-documented chamber, a stone sarcophagus flanked by Corinthian pillars and a marble relief depicting the keys of St. Peter. The site had been unchanged for centuries, until it wasn't. When the team returned the following morning to begin a photometric survey, something was wrong. The tomb's dimensions no longer matched the drawings taken the day before. The left pillar now tilted ever so slightly inward. The relief had shifted by 4 centimeters, and most unsettling of all, the sarcophagus lid, previously adorned with the papal crest, now bore a different motif altogether, a winged lion holding a closed book. This symbol, traditionally associated with the evangelist Mark, had no historical connection to Julius II. The team rechecked their materials, certain they had made an error, but archival photographs taken the previous afternoon confirmed their memory. The crest had changed. Panic spread through the team. The site was sealed, and a report was quietly submitted to the Secretariat of State. No public mention was made. When restoration resumed 2 days later, the tomb had returned to its original form. The papal crest was back. The dimensions aligned. No explanation was offered. Officially, the discrepancy was chalked up to a photographic error and optical fatigue. But among those who had seen the change firsthand, the incident became known as the shift, an event treated with the kind of respectful silence usually reserved for visions or relics. A few months later, one of the junior masons confided in a Monsignor that he had touched the lion-engraved stone when it had appeared. "It was warm," he said, "like something alive, or something waking up." He left Vatican employment shortly after. Whether the tomb physically changed, or whether the observers glimpsed some brief overlap in time or meaning, no one can say. But the crypt of Julius II has not been disturbed since. It rests in stillness, unchanged, yet never quite trusted by those who know what it once was, if only for a single night. Hidden within a leather-bound codex misfiled for decades under agricultural correspondence in the Vatican Library is a parchment fragment that has sparked quiet unrest among the few scholars who have seen it. Written in Greek on aged vellum, the document is believed to date from the early 2nd century and contains no title, no author, and no canonical markings. It is composed as a gospel, complete with parables, sayings, and a final passion narrative. But what sets it apart is its narrator. The voice throughout belongs to a woman, unnamed, veiled in every scene, who speaks not as a follower of Christ, but as someone who walked beside him in silence. Vatican archivists who stumbled upon it during a collection reassessment in the 1990s dubbed it Evangelium Velatae, the Gospel of the Veiled One. In the text, the veiled woman witnesses the same events recounted in the 4 canonical Gospels, but her observations differ in tone and detail. She describes Jesus weeping not just at Lazarus's tomb, but again alone, beneath an olive tree after rebuking the money changers. She recounts an argument between Peter and Mary Magdalene about who was worthy to touch the book of names. And most striking of all, she claims to have buried a scroll in the hills outside Bethany at Christ's request, something he told her would one day speak when no other voice could be heard. These passages, while poetic, are theologically disruptive. They suggest that Christ entrusted certain truths to those deliberately kept in the background, and that the Church's foundations rest in part on stories left untold. The parchment's ink, when tested in 2001, was found to match a rare composition used in early Christian communities near Alexandria. A marginal note in Latin, added centuries later by an unknown scribe, reads simply, "Non legendum in missa," not to be read at Mass. That note alone has kept the document in obscurity. Today it resides in a secure, climate-controlled drawer beneath the Archivum Apocryphorum, sealed away like a theological mine too dangerous to disturb. Those who believe in its authenticity argue it is the missing voice of a disciple erased by time and custom. Others fear it could upend the structure of revelation altogether. But among the few who have read the Veiled One's final line, there is agreement. It is not heresy, it is haunting. Truth, she writes, is what remains when the powerful forget to watch. In the final years of the 16th century, St. Peter's Basilica stood unfinished. Michelangelo's bold design for the dome had been partially realized, but the engineering remained unstable, the upper ribs yet to be completed. After his death in 1564, the project passed through a series of successors, none more enigmatic than Giovanni Francesco Strozzi, a Florentine architect and mathematician whose involvement with the basilica remains largely undocumented. Unlike his contemporaries, Strozzi left behind no treatises, no self-glorifying plaques, and no apprentices. But his signature appears in the corner of a single vellum blueprint archived in the Vatican's Ufficio delle Fabbriche. It is dated March 12, 1577, and after that, he vanishes. Official records from the Fabbrica di San Pietro list him as present at the dome's central inspection platform on April 2nd of that year. A team of masons and engineers gathered to evaluate the stresses in the encircling drum before construction resumed. The platform, suspended by a network of timber and iron above the transept, was treacherous, prone to sway and collapse. According to a surviving journal entry by an assistant named Rinaldo Peruzzi, Maestro Strozzi stepped beyond the scaffold edge, gazing upward. He turned to speak and was no longer there. A search of the area turned up no trace. No fall was heard, no body recovered. The platform showed no signs of failure. The disappearance was attributed to misadventure, a quiet funeral held in absentia. Yet in 1741, a maintenance crew repairing the dome's inner lining discovered something extraordinary: a narrow cavity, previously uncharted, concealed behind one of the support niches. Inside was a small bundle of personal effects, a wooden drafting compass, a sealed tin ink pot, and a folded note bearing Strozzi's initials. The note, written in tight Latin script, read, "Non cadi, vidi, I did not fall, I saw." The objects were removed, logged, and quietly stored in the Vatican's architectural archive. No public announcement was made. But since that time, strange reports have surfaced among nighttime maintenance crews, of whispered calculations echoing within the dome, or fleeting glimpses of a solitary man in Florentine garb perched among the ribs, staring downward. To some, it is only legend. To others, Strozzi never left at all. He simply passed into the dome itself, a living equation folded between stone, space, and heaven. And perhaps, still watching, he waits for the final piece of geometry to fall into place. Deep within the Vatican's Sala delle Carte Antiche lies a scroll too delicate for public display, and too dangerous, some argue, for general scholarship. It is known by a name scribbled on its ivory-colored backing: Mappa Mundi Eternitatis, the Eternal World Map. Created around the year 1606 and attributed to Cardinal Cesare Monti, a brilliant but controversial cartographer and ecclesiastical diplomat, the map does not merely depict continents and seas. It presents the world as a theological diagram layered over physical geography, aligning cathedrals, relic sites, and scriptural events in geometric correspondence. And at its center, unmissable in blood-colored ink, is St. Peter's Basilica, labeled not as a church, but as a core, a heart. Monti was a product of the Counter-Reformation's intellectual vanguard, a time when the Church sought to reclaim not just doctrine, but the very narrative of space. Educated in Padua and sent to Rome during a surge of anti-Copernican sentiment, he became obsessed with reconciling spiritual cosmology with imperial expansion. In his private papers, Monti referred to the Vatican not merely as the seat of Peter, but as the pole of memory, the fixed point by which all divine history oriented itself. His map reflects this obsession. Jerusalem appears along the same latitude as Rome. Eden sits in the Tiber Valley. The crucifixion site overlays with the obelisk in St. Peter's Square. Nothing is where it should be, yet everything aligns. What shocked later viewers was not just the theological positioning, but the precision. The map's longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates, when tested against satellite data in the 21st century, show astonishing accuracy, down to half a degree in places no known 17th century expedition had ever reached. The Andes, the Antarctic Rim, even the buried ruins of Carthage are rendered with uncanny fidelity. No documents survive indicating how Monty could have acquired such information. His contemporaries accused him of heresy, geomancy, or worse. In 1610, the Vatican quietly confiscated all known copies of the map. Monty was reassigned to a distant monastery where he died in obscurity. The original scroll remains sealed in a temperature-controlled drawer beneath lead glass. A single viewing was granted to a Jesuit scholar in 1998. His only published comment, "It is not a map of where we've been, it's a map of where the Church believes we are going." Among the countless sacred objects held within the Vatican's treasury, few carry as much quiet mystique as the reliquary of Saint Procula, a 3rd century martyr revered in whispers rather than proclamations. Her name does not appear in official martyrologies, and no feast day honors her. Yet in a side chamber off the Basilica's sacristy, a gilded box rests in solemn stillness, engraved with her name in ancient Greek, Procula. Inside, however, there is nothing. No bone fragment, no cloth, no dust. And according to the ledger entry that accompanied its arrival in 1592, there never was. The reliquary was commissioned under Pope Clement VIII at the height of the Catholic Church's effort to reaffirm tradition through relics, processions, and physical manifestations of faith. It was said to have come from the catacombs of Priscilla, unearthed during excavations intended to retrieve early Christian bones. But when it was opened upon consecration, the interior was bare. Witnesses recorded a strange stillness in the room, a sensation not of absence, but of something invisible present. A cardinal who attended the blessing described it as an emptiness so deliberate it could only have been chosen. The reliquary was sealed nonetheless, placed with ceremony upon a small marble pedestal, and never opened again. Scholars have debated its significance for centuries. Some argue that the box was symbolic, a gesture toward spiritual relics, the memory of sanctity rather than the substance. Others suggest that Procula was a real figure whose bones were lost or hidden, but whose name survived in oral tradition. Yet, the most troubling theory is the one left unspoken in official commentaries, that the relic was deliberately left empty to commemorate a sacrifice that was meant to be erased. A marginal note from a 17th century nun found inside a devotional book stored near the reliquary reads cryptically, "She who was not seen yet kept the door." Some believe this refers to the women who aided the early church in secret, whose names were scrubbed from records. Others suspect the reliquary itself is a cipher, a vessel meant not to hold a saint, but to signal that one was taken. To this day, pilgrims pass the reliquary without fanfare, but a few pause, inexplicably drawn to the silence it radiates. And for those who know its history, the box remains one of the Vatican's strangest treasures, an artifact that contains nothing, yet guards a presence that refuses to leave. In a climate-controlled chamber beneath the Apostolic Library lies a codex so fragile it has been viewed in its entirety by fewer than a dozen people. Bound in goatskin and stitched with thread dyed a deep carmine, the manuscript bears no title on its spine, no signature, and no marginalia. Its only identifying mark is a symbol inked in the corner of the first page, a fish pierced by a dagger. Vatican archivists refer to it unofficially as Codex 72X, though a whispering few have another name for it, the Gospel of the Knife. What lies within its brittle folios is a retelling of the Passion unlike any sanctioned by the Church. The manuscript presents an account of Christ's final days not as a linear narrative, but as a set of overlapping voices, some human, others harder to define. The text speaks in tones alternately intimate and alien, as if recorded through memory and dream rather than sight and doctrine. In this version, Jesus is betrayed not only by Judas, but also by unnamed figures from the early Christian fold. The crucifixion is preceded by a strange rite in Gethsemane involving a veil, a chalice, and a word repeated 3 times in a tongue older than Aramaic. Mary, the mother of Jesus, speaks briefly, not to comfort, but to warn. Her words in the manuscript are chilling. He was not sent to die, but to wake us. We killed the message and mistook the man. The resurrection, too, is altered. Christ does not rise with triumph, but returns to a cave where he writes something in ash on a stone wall. No one is allowed to read it. He vanishes before dawn. Linguistic analysis places the manuscript's composition between the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, its Greek tinged with Coptic inflections. The ink contains traces of copper and burnt fig, a combination found in desert monastic texts from the Egyptian Thebaid. There is no mention of it in any published Vatican index. When a scholar from the Sorbonne requested access in 2007, his credentials were verified, but his request denied without explanation. When asked why, a senior librarian reportedly said, "It's not that it's false, it's that it's not ready." To some, the Codex is heresy, a fever dream of early dissent. To others, it is the last voice of a Christianity that never made it to Rome. A ghost gospel, buried beneath centuries of marble and silence, still waiting to be heard. Behind the sacristy of St. Peter's Basilica, far beyond the view of tourists and most clergy, lies a door few notice, carved from sycamore and iron, flanked by faded frescoes of unknown saints. There is no plaque, no guard, no entry key issued in modern times, but deep within the Vatican's internal security registry, this sealed room is known by a name almost mythic in the bureaucracy of Rome, Camera delle Cinque Serrature, the Chamber of the 5 Locks. It has been opened only 6 times in documented history, and each time it required the physical presence of 5 separate cardinals, each holding one of the iron keys forged to match its unique lock. The chamber dates back to the early 16th century, constructed under Pope Julius II during the height of the Vatican's territorial consolidation. The reason for its creation was never written into papal bulls, but private letters from the period suggest it was intended as a containment vault, a space for documents or objects considered too dangerous for destruction, yet too disruptive for the archives. According to a 1623 inventory unearthed during the papacy of Urban VIII, the room housed 3 crates labeled in Greek, 1 black lacquer box of Moorish origin, and a cloth bundle reportedly inscribed with the name Simon Magus, the first recorded heretic of Christianity. The locks themselves were crafted by a secret guild of locksmiths from Bologna, each sworn under oath of silence. What makes them unique is not just the craftsmanship, but the requirement that each lock must be opened simultaneously. If even one key turns out of sequence, the mechanism resets completely. This has made accidental entry impossible. Over the centuries, rumors have proliferated. that the chamber holds the last will of Constantine, a scroll written in the hand of Christ, or blueprints for technologies said to predate the flood. The last verified opening occurred in 1933 under Pope Pius XI. What was seen or moved remains unrecorded. Shortly afterward, 2 of the 5 cardinals involved were reassigned far from Rome. One died in Cairo under uncertain circumstances. Since then, the Vatican has issued no orders to reopen it, and one of the 5 original keys has reportedly gone missing. Without all 5, the chamber cannot be unlocked. To some, it is just another Vatican myth, an overgrown story wrapped in iron. But to others, it represents something far older than secrecy, the Church's final vault of dangerous memory, sealed not out of fear, but because some truths refuse to rest quietly. In the late winter of 1814, as Napoleon's empire crumbled and Europe braced for a new political order, a Carmelite monk named Brother Lucian arrived at the gates of the Vatican, carrying only a weathered satchel and a sealed letter of commendation from a French bishop. He was accepted into the Vatican Library's temporary scriptorium, a makeshift hall where displaced monastics were offered sanctuary in exchange for labor. Lucien was quiet, devout, and fluent in Latin, Greek, and Syriac, rare even among the Vatican's seasoned archivists. But it was not his linguistic skill that left an impression. It was what he claimed he had seen. Lucien told no one at first. Only after weeks of copying ancient glosses did he begin to confide in a Benedictine scholar named Father Aloysius. According to surviving fragments of Aloysius's diary, Lucien insisted that the visions he experienced were not dreams or divine revelations, but memories, clear, specific recollections of events that had not yet occurred. He spoke of inventions he could not name, towers of glass, chariots without horses, voices carried through metal boxes. He drew maps showing coastlines altered by water, cities whose names no one recognized, and wars fought with invisible fire. When questioned on the source of his knowledge, Lucien simply replied, "I was born too soon, but not before." Alarmed but curious, Father Aloysius brought Lucien's sketches and statements to a Jesuit linguist assigned to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The response was swift. Lucien was removed from the scriptorium, his papers confiscated, and his name stricken from the guest records. But one document survived, a parchment found decades later behind a false panel in the library wall. It bore Lucien's handwriting and a single Latin phrase repeated 4 times, "Tempus est clausum," time is closed. Some historians regard Lucien as a madman, a casualty of post-war trauma. Others argue he may have suffered from an unknown neurological condition that blurred his sense of time. But among the few who have reviewed his recovered notes, now locked away in a restricted archive, there is consensus on one thing. Many of the events he described have since come to pass, including the redivision of Rome's suburbs, the establishment of Israel, and a pope resigning his office. No grave for Brother Lucien exists within Vatican walls, though a death certificate lists him as buried in the Teutonic Cemetery. The plot is unmarked, and yet, on certain evenings near the Archivum Gate, staff report seeing an old man seated beneath the lantern scribbling into a small black journal. When approached, he vanishes. Beneath the basilica's northern transept lies a forgotten chamber, chiseled into the bedrock centuries before Michelangelo's dome crowned the skyline. Its walls are plain, lacking ornamentation or inscription, and its ceiling is low enough to demand a bowed head. There are no frescoes, no candles, and no scent of incense, only a single slab of pale stone resting on a raised base in the center of the room. Vatican custodians refer to it with quiet reluctance as l'altare senza nome, the altar with no name. No registry logs its construction. no consecration documents exist, and no Mass has ever been publicly said upon it. The room first came to official notice in 1857 during a routine inspection of subterranean moisture damage. Workers widening a drainage shaft broke through what they assumed was a maintenance wall, only to discover the chamber intact, dustless, and undisturbed. Atop the altar, resting precisely in the center, was a narrow strip of lambskin parchment bearing a single phrase in Syriac. He was known before the names. It was dated using ink composition and script style to approximately the late 1st century AD, predating even the earliest Christian liturgies in Rome. The parchment was removed and archived, the chamber sealed and left unmarked, but not all left it behind. In the decades that followed, rumors emerged of strange requests from visiting clergy, quiet entreaties to visit the unnamed altar, often at night, always alone. A few claimed to return changed, their countenances subdued, their sermons softened or made more urgent. In one case, a cardinal from Lisbon resigned his post within days of praying there, citing a voice clearer than Rome. No formal statements were ever issued. Yet a quiet rule was established. Only those granted explicit permission from the Secretariat of State may descend to the altar, and even then no relics may be brought near it. Speculation about the altar's origin abounds. Some believe it is older than the Basilica, perhaps a pre-Christian site repurposed by early converts. Others suggest it marks the burial of a figure not recorded in Scripture, someone whose presence predates even Peter. But the most whispered theory is that it was never meant to be found at all, that it is not an altar of offering but of remembrance, placed there not to be worshipped upon, but to remind those in power that the Church's roots run deeper than dogma. And still it waits in darkness, untouched by incense or chant, bearing no name, but holding a silence more enduring than any monument above it. In the spring of 1942, as war engulfed Europe and the Vatican stood as a strange island of neutrality amidst devastation, something inexplicable was heard, or rather, not heard, within the ancient walls of St. Peter's Basilica. It began during a twilight Vespers service when a handful of Swiss guards posted along the nave reported an unidentifiable hum drifting through the colonnades. It wasn't the organ, it wasn't the clergy, and no congregation was present. The sound, if it could be called that, carried no words, no melody, only the unmistakable sensation of harmony moving through the air, as if silence itself had begun to vibrate. The phenomenon occurred again over the following weeks, always in the early evening, always when the nave was mostly empty. Choir members assigned to the Capella Julia, the Vatican's famed musical ensemble, claimed to feel their throats tighten with emotion while preparing for rehearsal, even before singing a note. Some described hearing harmonies in their minds, others in their chests, like a resonance they had not produced but somehow carried. One tenor reportedly wept without understanding why. A low-ranking deacon, skeptical of the stories, finally entered alone one evening with a tuning fork in hand. The fork began to vibrate before he touched it to anything. A decision was made to record the occurrences using the limited audio technology of the time. 2 reel-to-reel tapes were placed discreetly behind the main altar for a week. When reviewed, the recordings captured nothing. No audible voice, no static, no ambient hum. But technicians reported headaches, blurred vision, and a strange sense of euphoria while listening. One insisted he could hear something on the tape only when his eyes were closed, describing it as the echo of something that never had sound to begin with. Theories circulated, of course. Some believed the choir was spiritual, a vestige of the countless voices who had sung within those walls over centuries, each note impressed upon stone and time. Others suspected an acoustic anomaly, a trick of architecture and fatigue. But the more superstitious among the Vatican custodians offered another explanation, that in times of deep crisis, when faith falters or rises unseen, the Basilica itself sings, not in sound, but in spirit. The events stopped as suddenly as they began, just days before the Allied liberation of Rome. Since then, only scattered reports have emerged, always at dusk, always when no one is watching. And for those who were there, the memory of that soundless choir lingers not in the ears, but in the marrow, like a psalm composed in a language no living tongue can speak. In a discreet recess of the Vatican Pinacoteca, away from the radiant works of Raphael and the golden halos of Giotto, rests a crucifix few visitors notice and fewer still understand. It hangs in a dimly lit side corridor, unaccompanied by a plaque or explanation, suspended from a modest iron bracket. The wood is dark, nearly black, and bears no ornamentation, no inscription, no gold leaf, no ivory inlay. Only the figure of Christ, carved with stark realism, face bowed, arms taut. But what distinguishes this crucifix from all others is something so subtle it went undetected for decades. It casts no shadow. The anomaly was first noted in 1889 by an Austrian art historian cataloging minor devotional artifacts. He recorded the strange observation in a personal notebook, noting that though the hallway is lit unevenly by a series of western-facing windows, this cross remains without silhouette. Its form is lit, but does not block the light. His remarks were quietly ignored by church officials, dismissed as a metaphor or an error of draftsmanship. But in 1926, a Vatican electrician assigned to rewire the corridor discovered that no matter how the lighting was adjusted, whether incandescent, natural, or candle-based, the crucifix absorbed light but never obstructed it. The wall behind remained untouched. Multiple tests followed. Photographers attempted to document the phenomenon, but their prints showed a faint smudge where the shadow should be, as though something resisted the camera's understanding of contrast. One Jesuit physicist, permitted to study the piece under controlled conditions in 1954, published a private report concluding that the object interacts with light in a way inconsistent with known materials. It reflects, refracts, and absorbs, but does not interrupt. The crucifix was then removed from study, returned to its quiet post, and never discussed publicly again. Theories, of course, emerged. Some believed the cross was carved from wood found in the Holy Land, perhaps even from trees rooted near Golgotha. Others suggested it was a relic crafted by mystics, designed to remind viewers that Christ's sacrifice was meant not to obstruct the world's light, but to pass through it, transfigured. And then there are those who claim the lack of shadow means something far older, that the figure affixed to the cross is not just a representation, but a placeholder for something that was never entirely physical to begin with. Today, the crucifix still hangs in silence, its lack of shadow unnoticed by most. But those who linger in its presence often feel an odd stillness, a pause in time, a quieting of the heart, as though even the light has knelt before it. In the vast ceremonial history of the papacy, few symbols carry more weight than the ring of the fisherman, the signet ring worn by each pope as the spiritual successor to St. Peter. Traditionally destroyed upon a pope's death or abdication, the ring is a seal of authority and a key to legitimacy. But there is one ring, nearly forgotten now, that was never destroyed and never passed on. It belonged to Pope Benedict XIV, who reigned from 1740 to 1758, a scholar pope known for his intellect, wit, and obsessive cataloging of miracles. His ring, unlike any before or since, could not be removed, not by hand, not by force, not even after death. Accounts vary. But the first mention of the anomaly appears in a confidential letter written by Cardinal Prospero Lambertini shortly before his election as Pope. In it, he describes a dream in which a fisherman handed him a ring made of bone, not gold, and whispered, "You will never cast this back into the sea." Upon his elevation to the papacy, Benedict commissioned a new signet modeled on that vision, a plain band engraved not with Peter in his boat, but with a broken net and a dove with folded wings. It was cast in an unusual alloy, rumored to contain relic dust from an early Christian martyr. When Benedict XIV died in 1758, the College of Cardinals prepared to perform the traditional Rituale Romani, which included the ceremonial breaking of the ring. But the ring would not budge. It could not be slipped off his finger, nor cut with shears. Goldsmiths and masons were summoned. They tried acids, chisels, even surgical extraction, but the ring remained affixed, unyielding, as though fused with the bone itself. Out of reverence and growing unease, the cardinals elected to bury the Pope with it intact. His finger was not broken. The body was sealed inside a triple coffin and interred beneath the Basilica. In 1939, when parts of the grotto were reopened during excavation work, whispers surfaced that the tomb had been disturbed, not by looters, but by Vatican officials seeking the ring. Whether they found it, or whether it had somehow vanished, remains unknown. No official comment was ever made. Today, in a quiet glass case within the papal reliquary vault, there sits an unmarked finger bone, charred at the base, smooth at the joint. No ring encircles it. But curators speak little of how it arrived, or what it once bore. Above a narrow side altar in the Basilica's south transept is a modest mosaic often overlooked by pilgrims and tourists alike. It depicts Christ at Gethsemane, head bowed, surrounded by a grove of olive trees under a pale moon. The scene is somber, restrained, its hues subdued, its composition conventional. For nearly 2 centuries, it drew little attention. But in the early hours of October 4th, 1962, just days before the opening of the Second Vatican Council, something changed. The mosaic, untouched by human hand, had altered. The discovery was made by a janitor named Angelo Spada, who arrived before dawn to polish the chapel floors. He paused to light a votive, looked up, and froze. The figure of Christ had shifted. His face, once turned downward in quiet prayer, now looked out, not up toward heaven nor inward toward suffering, but directly ahead, as if meeting the viewer's gaze. More startling still, one of the olive trees behind him now bore a twisted ribbon of gold, unfurling like a scroll, etched with faint Aramaic. Spada, unsure whether his memory failed him, alerted the clergy. Within hours, a dozen Vatican officials had gathered. Experts confirmed the change. Photographs taken days prior showed Christ in his original posture and no golden ribbon. Yet there was no sign of tampering, no fragments displaced, no adhesives disturbed. The tesserae, the tiny colored tiles, fit seamlessly. The grout was unbroken. Conservators ruled out environmental causes, no shifts in moisture, no microfractures, no seismic vibrations. And the Aramaic script? It read, loosely translated, "The cup has passed, but the wine remains." Theories spiraled. Some believed it was a miracle, a quiet divine message sent to coincide with the most dramatic reform council in modern church history. Others suspected a deeply skilled act of artistic sabotage. A few whispered that the mosaic had not changed, but revealed itself, that what had always been there had become visible only now. Pope John XIII, when briefed, reportedly smiled and said, "Not all Gospels are written in books." No official explanation was ever released. Today, the mosaic remains as it was that morning. Most pass beneath it without a second glance, but those who remember the old image swear by its transformation. And every October, on the anniversary of its change, the light from the high clerestory catches the ribbon of gold just so, shimmering like a living thread in the fabric of stone. In the endless marble corridors of the Vatican museums, where centuries of relics line the walls and silence reigns like liturgy, there is a storage room rarely discussed and never shown to the public. Designated Archivum D23, it was originally intended as a temporary repository for displaced sarcophagi and statuary fragments recovered from subterranean digs beneath St. Peter's. But since 1971, the chamber has been closed to curators and cleaning staff alike, not by decree, but by quiet consensus, because no matter how many times it is entered, cleaned, or sealed, the same fine dust always returns. The dust first drew attention during an inventory audit conducted by Sister Evelina, a lay archivist trained in antiquities conservation. She logged the room as containing fragments from 4th century Christian burial chambers, a few broken inscriptions, and the headless torso of a Roman deity, likely Jupiter or Mithras. What struck her as odd was the layer of dust that coated everything, despite the room having been sealed since 1963. Thinking it residue from deteriorating mortar or insulation, she returned the next day with standard cleaning materials. She wiped each surface clean. But when she came back less than 24 hours later, the dust had returned, identical in texture, color, and coverage. Over the following weeks, more attempts were made. The room was vacuum sealed, then monitored. The dust came back. Air vents were tested, stones sampled, nearby artifacts inspected for decay. Nothing explained it. The dust bore a silvery hue under light, almost luminous, with no consistent particulate makeup. Analysis at the Vatican's chemical lab returned inconclusive results, describing the substance as non-classifiable mineral fragments with organic traces, aged beyond measurable dating techniques. Then came the more peculiar reports. Workers assigned to the room began to complain of vertigo, dreams of burial chambers, and a strange auditory sensation. Not voices, but echoes, like soft footsteps in gravel. One even claimed to find a palm print in the dust upon entering, though no one else had access. After a year of quiet frustration, the chamber was sealed with iron brackets and reassigned as inactive storage. And still, when someone is dispatched to verify its status, the same ritual occurs. The door opens, a flashlight scans the room, and there it lies, the dust, unbroken, glimmering faintly in the half-light. It collects in corners, outlines fragments, and always, impossibly, settles in the shape of a cross at the room's center, as though the very stones beneath St. Peter's dome were shedding some memory the Church cannot quite contain. Buried deep within the Vatican's Liber Pontificalis, the chronicle of popes dating back to St. Peter himself, lies a curious omission, not an erased name, but a skipped number. Between the reigns of Pope Stephen III and Pope Adrian I in the 8th century, there is an unexplained absence, a disruption in the continuity that no official commentary acknowledges. For centuries, scholars assumed it was a clerical error, a copying mistake by monastic scribes. But within an uncatalogued drawer in the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana lies a manuscript bound in deerskin that tells a different story. It is unsigned, unindexed, and bears a cryptic title in Latin, Pontifex Intervallum, the Pope Between. The text is a narrative, not a register, written not as a papal biography but as a confession, possibly authored by a Vatican librarian or bishop close to the unnamed pontiff. It describes a man chosen in haste during a time of chaos, a moment when Lombard forces threatened the very gates of Rome and the Byzantine exarchate was in disarray. The conclave, fearing political collapse, elected a monk known only by his religious name, Leo of Ephesus. He was not Roman, nor noble, nor politically aligned, only learned, devout, and, as the manuscript hints, disturbingly visionary. According to the account, Leo's papacy lasted only 29 days. But during that short reign, he issued no bulls, convened no councils, and received no emissaries. Instead, he retreated into the Lateran Palace archives and remained there day and night, emerging only once to deliver a sermon to a nearly empty basilica. Witnesses recorded only fragments, but one line was repeated in multiple versions. "There is no throne beneath the keys, only a door." On the 30th morning, Leo vanished. No illness, no corpse, no resignation. The papal ring was found beside his empty cot, still warm to the touch. In the following days, the College of Cardinals reconvened, declared his election void, and elected Adrian. Leo's name was omitted from all official records. Yet in the margins of certain 9th-century psalters, scribes drew a figure in a white cassock walking alone through a walled city, head bowed, keys in hand, but never unlocking a gate. No one has ever located his tomb, and so he remains, the Pope who reigned but was never crowned, remembered not through proclamation but through absence, a silence so complete that it echoes louder than any canonized decree. In a forgotten corridor beneath the Apostolic Palace, where the light of the sun has never touched and even the air carries the scent of centuries, there is a doorway that leads nowhere, at least nowhere known. Its arch is narrow, carved from travertine older than the basilica itself, and it bears no signage, no frame, no visible hinges. For generations, custodians and archivists referred to it only in whispers, calling it porta inversa, the gate that opens inward. What makes the door unusual is not what lies beyond it, but how it behaves. It opens, but only in, and once it closes, it cannot be opened again, at least not from this side. The earliest reference to the gate comes from a 10th-century inventory of underground chapels commissioned by Pope John XII. A monk named Gerbert, later known as Pope Sylvester II, scribbled a marginal note beside the entry. "This door consumes those who seek too much." It was dismissed for centuries as metaphor, a comment on theological arrogance. But in 1620, during renovations to the lower basilica, 2 masons attempted to break through the wall behind the gate to make room for ventilation shafts. Only one returned. The survivor, a man named Baccio, was found 3 days later in the catacombs below San Sebastiano, barefoot and unable to speak. He died months later without ever writing or uttering a word about what happened. The church quietly ordered the wall reinforced with a second layer of basalt. A crucifix was placed over the lintel, and a decree issued forbidding further construction within 20 feet of the gate. But as recently as the 1970s, a Jesuit archivist conducting spatial surveys with echolocation equipment noted that the interior space behind the gate did not match the building's known geometry. The wall reverberated unnaturally, as though the echo turned back on itself. When he submitted his report to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, it was quietly filed and never published. Some believe the gate is symbolic, an ancient architectural memento mori intended to humble the curious. Others suspect it was part of an earlier religious structure, perhaps even a Mithraic temple, repurposed and forgotten. But the most unnerving theory is that the gate was built not to welcome entry, but to contain something that once stepped through. Today, it remains locked, unmoving. Those who have stood before it say the air shifts when you draw close, as if the room itself draws breath. No handle, no keyhole, only stone, only silence. only the sense that if it opens again, it will not be the Vatican that enters. In the Vatican Apostolic Archive, where centuries of unopened correspondence and sealed bulls rest in climate-controlled silence, there is a box known only to a handful of archivists, one that was never supposed to be opened. It is labeled Bulla Tenebris, the Seal of Shadows, and was first catalogued in 1817 under Pope Pius VII after being discovered during a reorganization of suppressed Jesuit materials. The seal bore no papal insignia, only a scorched impression of a serpent devouring its tail, an Ouroboros rarely used in church symbology and typically associated with Gnostic heresies. The document inside was stored under triple lock, one physical, one symbolic, one procedural. The physical lock was a bar of consecrated silver forged to snap only under high temperature. The symbolic lock was a benediction in Latin etched across the box's lid, effectively cursing any who opened it without pontifical permission. The procedural lock required a cardinal from each of 3 dicasteries to sign the release. For over 150 years, it remained untouched. But on the morning of June 29, 1984, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, the lock was found broken. The box stood open, and no one claimed responsibility. Security logs showed no breach. Cameras stationed in the archive recorded nothing out of the ordinary. The key register had no anomalies, but the box was undeniably open. The silver seal had not been cut, pried, or melted. It was fractured cleanly, down the middle, like glass under pressure. Inside was a single parchment, so brittle it could not be unrolled without disintegrating. What little was recovered came from microscopic analysis of the ink on the scroll's edge. Phrases in Chaldean, a language known only to a handful of pre-Christian sects in Mesopotamia, and a repeated refrain. The mouth is silent, but the teeth remember. What the document originally contained is unknown, but in the weeks that followed, several archivists fell ill, nothing fatal, but marked by migraines, insomnia, and fainting spells. One began to speak in languages he did not know. Another left his post and joined a monastic order in seclusion. When asked why, he replied, "Some things were meant to remain sealed, even by God's design." The box was resealed, but never relocked. It now sits deeper in the archive, unmarked. And while no one is officially forbidden from viewing it, few ever ask. Because in the Vatican, a seal that opens without hands is not a question, it's a warning. One the walls still seem to whisper if you listen long enough. Tucked away in the lesser-known halls of the Vatican's Museo Storico, among papal vestments and dusty ceremonial items rarely shown to the public, stands an object that curators have rotated in and out of storage for centuries. A mirror, roughly the height of a man, framed in tarnished bronze, its glass dark as obsidian. It is not labeled. There is no mention of it in visitor guides, and it carries no plaque to honor its provenance. But among those tasked with its safekeeping, it is known simply as speculum invertum, the inverted mirror. Tradition claims the mirror was brought to the Vatican during the sack of Constantinople in 1204, taken from a ruined Eastern monastery whose walls were scorched and whose monks had vanished without trace. It was said to hang in their chapel, not as a vanity, but as a test. When a man stood before it in prayer, he would see not himself, but his soul, not a vision of the afterlife, but the weight of his own sanctity, or its absence. That may be folklore, but the stories that followed its arrival in Rome are documented in handwritten custodial reports dating back to the 14th century. Several witnesses, including bishops and scholars, recorded a peculiar experience when standing before the mirror. They reported no reflection, only darkness, and in that darkness, fleeting glimpses of unfamiliar faces, not demonic, but empty. A bishop in 1452 collapsed after standing before it for less than a minute, murmuring that the glass showed a church with no windows. In 1731, a Jesuit theologian attempted to study the mirror by placing it in front of consecrated relics. The relics reflected faintly, but without their gold cases, as though the divine had been stripped away. Even Pope Clement XIII is rumored to have stood before it in private. His diary, later seized by Vatican archivists, allegedly contained a single cryptic entry after the encounter. It does not lie, but it does not forgive. Today, the mirror remains shrouded, stored beneath linen in a locked storeroom. Staff assigned to its care are rotated every 6 months. Some refuse to enter the room alone. The last restoration attempt in 1965 ended abruptly when a technician claimed the mirror turned darker the closer he came. He resigned the next day. The Church has never declared it heretical, nor sacred. It exists in that narrow space the Vatican rarely acknowledges, where belief, fear, and memory bleed into each other like candle smoke on ancient glass. In the tangled underworld beneath Vatican City, below the Scavi, beneath the necropolis, deeper even than the Roman-era foundations, there exists a tunnel that appears on no blueprint, no excavation chart, no subterranean schematic. It was discovered not by archaeologists or clerics, but by accident in 1959 when engineers were laying conduit for new telephone lines near the Apostolic Palace. A minor tremor had cracked part of a service shaft, revealing a seam in the stone that gave way under pressure. What lay beyond was a smooth, arched corridor, carved not by modern tools, but with an elegance more ancient than the basilica above. The floor was dry, the air was cool. There were no markings on the walls, no frescoes, no Latin inscriptions, but the tunnel extended in a perfect line, northeast toward Castel Sant'Angelo. A team was dispatched to trace its length, equipped with oxygen monitors and surveying gear. They walked nearly a kilometer before the passage narrowed, ending abruptly at a wall of untouched limestone. When they turned to go back, one technician, Paolo Lazzaro, noticed something unsettling. His watch, synchronized before descent, was 2 hours slow. His colleagues had stopped entirely. Word of the tunnel's discovery was escalated quickly to the Secretariat of State. The entry point was resealed with reinforced concrete. But the matter didn't end there. In 1961, a second exploratory team, sanctioned quietly by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, re-entered the shaft. They brought with them a theologian fluent in Syriac, a Jesuit trained in ancient ritual languages, and a physicist specializing in magnetism. None of them reported unusual visual features, but all noted the same auditory anomaly: absolute silence, no echo, no ambient sound. Even their footsteps seemed absorbed by the stone, as though sound itself refused to travel in the space. Upon return, one member of the party insisted that the tunnel had shifted in length, that the walk back had taken longer, that the walls seemed closer. His measurements didn't align with those taken on the way in. He was dismissed, quietly, and the project closed. The Vatican declared the tunnel a structural anomaly, unrelated to church heritage, and buried all documentation in a restricted archive. But rumors persist. Some believe the tunnel is part of an abandoned escape route constructed in the 9th century. Others think it is far older, predating Christianity, perhaps linking to forgotten rites once held in Rome's pagan temples. A few whisper that it was never built by human hands at all, that it was uncovered, not made. A path that appears only when the church strays too far from what lies beneath it. And though the concrete still holds, some custodians say they can feel something beneath their feet, especially at night. A subtle pressure, like the weight of stones slowly remembering the way back to light. Locked away in a temperature-controlled vault beneath the Vatican Library is a single manuscript, bound in goatskin so aged it flakes at the corners like old bark. It bears no title, no author, no date. The ink is faded but legible, written in an archaic Latin so stylized it puzzled even seasoned paleographers when it was first examined in 1933. The Church catalogued it as Codex Veneris, a name drawn not from Venus the goddess, but from the Latin root venari, to hunt. Because what this book does, according to those who've studied it, is not simply inform, it tracks. The manuscript came to the Vatican under mysterious circumstances. It was left at the Porta Sant'Anna by an anonymous donor wrapped in oilcloth, accompanied only by a note written in ecclesiastical Greek. Return this to where it watches. The pages were filled with reflections, prophecies, and seemingly impossible historical details, written centuries before the events they describe. A papal assassination attempt in 1857. The exact hour of the breach of the Lateran Treaty in 1929. Even the resignation of a pope predicted with disturbing precision. But the most unsettling feature of Codex Veneris is that it appears to be unfinished. The final page ends mid-sentence, and every attempt to replicate or translate the text has failed, because each copy, handwritten or digital, scrambles within days, as though resisting duplication. In 1964, a Jesuit linguist attempted to transcribe it word for word. 3 days later, he discovered the original manuscript had added a new sentence. No one else had access. The page had not been opened, yet the ink was fresh. That same year, a fragment of the manuscript was exposed under ultraviolet light for conservation. New characters appeared, invisible to the naked eye, verses not yet fulfilled. The writing was in the same hand. Analysts confirmed the ink matched previous samples, with no signs of recent tampering. The Church halted further exposure tests immediately. Over the decades, only a small circle of Vatican scholars have been permitted to view the Codex, always under supervision. Some believe it is a forgery designed to destabilize faith. Others call it a trap, a mirror for the papacy, reflecting its fears before they become real. And still others claim it is not writing at all, but listening, that the book does not tell the future. It waits for the future to tell it what to say. Even now, the final page remains incomplete, but the parchment still feels warm to the touch, and the ink never quite dries. In the shadows beneath St. Peter's Basilica, among tombs both known and forgotten, lies one burial site that no inscription marks, no guidebook mentions, and no priest will bless. It is located near the ancient necropolis discovered during the 1940s excavations ordered by Pope Pius XII. Those same excavations that unearthed what may be the bones of Peter himself. But this particular grave, sealed in haste and left unrecorded, was discovered slightly beyond the official map of the dig, behind a crumbling masonry wall from the Constantinian era. It had no sarcophagus, no name, only a loosely laid stack of stones, hastily assembled as if the burial had not been planned. The team who uncovered it in 1942 assumed it was an early Christian martyr, perhaps hidden during Nero's persecutions. But when the stones were removed, they found no skeletal remains, only a bundle of cloth, tightly wrapped and bound with 7 iron nails. Inside was a human heart, preserved in resin. Nearby lay a single Latin phrase scratched into the stone with a crude implement. Non revertetur ad pulverem. It shall not return to dust. Puzzled, the archaeologists recorded the find and submitted it to church authorities. Within days, the chamber was resealed and their notes classified. The silence did not last. In 1957, a second team excavating a nearby corridor reported hearing the sound of soft knocking from beneath the sealed floor. They assumed it was shifting stone, perhaps even structural settling. But in the weeks that followed, several workers reported dreams of a figure wrapped in linen, walking through basilica halls no longer standing, One priest began to lose his sight shortly after visiting the grave. Another, assigned to bless the area, collapsed while reciting prayers and never returned to the site. No one has attempted to open the grave again, but curators working near the site have noted something strange. Over time, the mortar used to reseal the chamber has begun to flake, despite the climate controls and stabilization efforts. The floor above, directly beneath the nave, has developed a slight bow, as though something presses upward from the crypt below. No explanation has satisfied the engineers. To this day, Vatican officials deny the grave's existence, but those who work the midnight custodial shifts say they avoid that section entirely. Some claim the incense burns faster in the nearby chapels. Others say that on certain feast days you can smell myrrh, sweet, ancient, and bitter, rising from the stone, because not everything buried beneath St. Peter's dome was meant to rest in peace. Some secrets entombed there have not finished speaking.